This morning, by the way, we were supposed to start with a Zoom presentation coming from Italy with our speaker, Marcelo Gleiser. Unfortunately, it turned out there was a major power outage in that part of Tuscany, and we couldn't hook up. But to give you a quick idea of what you missed, what we all missed, Marcelo Gleiser just started a 3-year extended sabbatical to the Tuscany region of Italy, where he is staying at a 16th century abbey and villa, poor Marcelo, where he's going to be, he's putting together a think tank focusing on exactly what we're talking about here, is how can we get humanity back connected to the natural world and not the way we're heading. And anyway, it's unfortunate we missed him. He's written a book, which we have up here to sell. By the way, he's also a professor at Dartmouth. He professes natural philosophy, theoretical physics, astronomy, and theology. You know, we're supposed to use like 4% of our brain. He's got it all going. This guy is amazing. The book is The Dawn of a Mindful Universe. It's an urgent call for a new enlightenment and recognition of the preciousness of life and a foundation, using the foundations of science to study, nurture, and ultimately preserve humanity. It would have been a very interesting talk, but unfortunately, I've never heard of a Zoom call going wrong before either. Okay, welcome back. Before we get started, let me give you one more reminder about the incredibly wonderful feeling you get from making a voluntary contribution to our cause. The envelope, the QR code on your thing I told you about this morning, you can go either make a donation through PayPal or Venmo. If you do, thank you very much. Okay. First topic is The Land is Not Wild. And the person you're going to be hearing from is Rosalyn Lapier. Rosalyn is an author, a member of the Blackfeet Nation. She's spoken here before in earlier events, festivals for us. She's an ethnobiologist, which is a scientist who studies how people use plants native to their region for food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. Rosalyn will talk about traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and the historic land practices and land management practices of indigenous women. So with that, please welcome Rosalyn Lapier.
Thanks, everybody, for coming back. I know this is siesta time, so if I were out in the audience, I'd probably be taking a nap at this point. So first of all, I'd like to thank the folks from the McLean Literary Festival for inviting me to return again to come talk. And I would like to, you'll see in just a moment, I always think that I shouldn't just be standing up here alone by myself talking, so I asked my good friend Montoya Whiteman, who is a photographer among lots of things, to share some photographs that she recently did just a couple weeks ago, actually, in Montana. So as I'm talking, it's just going to be random. There's going to be a random slideshow behind me of her photography, and it may or may not fit what I'm talking about. Most of these photographs they took at the Metcalf Preserve, right, that's south of us, and then some of them are from the Bison Range. So I'm going to let you know that I'm going to be reading my talk today, partly to try and stay on time, because I am a college professor and we love to talk, and you just don't get us going. And then also because I'm going to be reading part of an essay that I wrote for Liz Carlisle, who will be coming up next, for a new book that they are the editor of, and they got together, I think, at least 24 folks to write essays about perennial foods. And so I wrote about the serviceberry, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the serviceberry today, but I'm going to be talking about lots of other stuff. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'll be reading my presentation. So today I plan to share some of my thoughts about the natural world and the things that I often think about when I write about nature. In some of my writing, I blend my family's stories into the larger narrative of American history, which includes a history of genocide, genocidal actions, and erasure. I'm usually trying to address a big overarching question, which is what was or is the relationship that Indigenous people had with the natural world. But to begin with, I'm going to do something that I often tell students to never do, which is I'm going to begin with a dictionary definition. Yeah, don't do this at home. So on my way here in the Chicago airport, I looked up the word wild on Uncle Google, and they offered this definition, which they claim came from the Oxford Dictionary. It is the internet, so you never know. So wild is defined as something that is uninhabitable, uncultivated, undomesticated, and inhospitable. So I would argue that this is actually a pretty accurate definition, and unfortunately, it's something that the United States government has used pretty close to this definition for the last 200 plus years. So historians argue that the myth that Native American land is quote-unquote wild has long pervaded American history and that it persists to the present. So today I plan to push back against this myth and other myths that unfortunately are codified in US public policy. And I hope to share a different perspective, which is an Indigenous perspective, which is why I titled this talk, "The Land is Not Wild." So a few years ago, I was a visiting professor at the Harvard Divinity School, where I taught about Indigenous religion, and I was completing my second book, which is called Invisible Reality. They had a really engaging community there, and people often met like at the cafe for like lunch and coffee and stuff. And one of the questions that professors and students often ask me is like, do Indigenous people have sacred texts? Because, you know, at a place like that, people talk about sacred text all the time, and it's often in books, it's in scrolls, it's quote-unquote written down, right? And so one of the things that always this question always, you know, took me aback, and I was just like, what? Of course, like, Native people have sacred text. It's just not, quote-unquote, like, written down in the way that you think. So since that time, I started thinking about like how to articulate this in writing when there are communities that are quote unquote like differently literate and they have sacred text. So I thought about it for a while, for a couple of years, didn't write anything down yet, but it was not until Taya Miles, who had then become a professor of history at Harvard, who contacted me and wanted me to write a short essay, the same way Liz just did, a short essay for a collection that she was doing, that I decided to write an essay called The Land as Sacred Text. And then it turned out to be, I ended up titling it The Land as Text. And it was published earlier last year in the Journal of Environmental History, along with an essay by Taya Miles, Lorette Savoy, and Connie Chang. So in The Land as Text, I explained how the Amskapi-Pukani, or the Blackfeet, which I'm a member of, embedded within the land and landscape their history and their sacred knowledge, and how these were connected to places and place names, and also to stories, songs, and rituals. And I shared how my grandparents, and particularly my grandmother, would recite dozens of stories every time we drove from Browning to Great Falls to go shopping. So each time we traveled, they would look out onto the land, onto the landscape, and whether it was near or far, or whether it was like an outcropping of trees, for those of you who are from eastern Montana, you know what I mean? There's not very many trees out there. And you know, hills, that they would start telling stories. And so this was something that I thought was, when I thought back about this, I thought that this was a really interesting method of sort of a mnemonic method of sharing history and sharing information. So each place, held a particular story and a history of the Blackfeet. And for them, the land was a text. They could see its pages and literally start reading it like a book. So to my grandparents, there were no blank pages. There was no empty space, just a book filled with stories. So I learned from them that the Blackfeet landscape was full of humans and non-humans, monsters ready to kill you, heroes waiting to save you, and deities who may or may not be interested in your continued existence. We have a different idea about deities and what they do. It was so full of stuff that you could not even hope for solitude. That's a dig at the Wilderness Act, by the way. Even if you were captured by the old grandmother and thrown into her cave made of boulders, that was one of my more favorite stories, you were not alone, because there was always going to be someone else in there with you, hiding in the dark. So this is the world that I grew up in, a place that was crowded and overflowing, bursting at the seams with people and activity and action. And whether it was at my grandparents' house or driving to town for groceries and listening to them, quote unquote, read the landscape, the world was full and alive. This is the world that influences my outlook on life today, my relationship to the land, as well as my advocacy for and writing about the natural world. So I want to shine a light on this point as I begin, that the Blackfeet lived in a world of abundance. Not only was the landscape full of stories, but the land was also full of food. So decades ago, I worked for an organization called the Pagan Institute, and one of the things I did was I interviewed a lot of elders. So one time while interviewing elders, while we were documenting the Blackfeet language, I asked one elder to translate the word awasen, which is often translated simply as land, like the land. So we sat there for over 2 hours as he explained that when you look out onto the Blackfeet landscape, you need to remember that it was like a kitchen or a pantry. It was a place where we managed the landscape, where we grew our own food, where we stored our food for future use, and similar to a kitchen or a pantry, where you knew exactly where to find something when you were looking for it. So after this discussion ended, he said, well, Awasin did not just mean like the land. It was a place managed to create abundance, a place where we knew where everything was, and it was a place where we got our food. So I want us to rethink and challenge the common myth, another common myth, that indigenous peoples were always on the verge of starvation or living a subsistence lifestyle, just relying on like what nature provided. Environmental historian Michael Wise has written a new book called Native Foods, Agriculture, Indigeneity, and Settler Colonialism in American History. I'll just say that it's a really fantastic book. If you have an opportunity to read it, it's really written for a general audience, where he says that the assumption that Native Americans living in impoverishment, hunger, or starvation is one of the 4 biggest myths in US history. This is true for the Blackfeet as well. The Blackfeet have very few stories that tell of scarcity or starvation. There is one story about the Aniskim, or buffalo stone, where a deity sought out a Blackfeet woman to teach her how to entice bison to go anywhere she wanted them to go when there was a time of scarcity. And even in this instance, in this story, the quote-unquote like moral to the story was how to manage and maintain abundance. So this is why when I encounter narratives that erase thousands of years of history of indigenous landscape management practices, especially practices led by indigenous women, and when those narratives claim that indigenous lands are quote-unquote wild, this is not only historically incorrect, to me at least, it's downright insulting. These kinds of myths that colonizers encountered quote-unquote empty land and Americans are preserving or conserving quote-unquote wilderness, I think are dangerous And those are narratives that we need to really think about, critique, and sort of stop the narrative. So increasingly, historians are recognizing that these are not so much myths as part of a powerful, invisible pillars that serve as the structural support of settler colonialism and white supremacy in the United States. And by confronting these kinds of myths, it not only enables a more honest assessment of the past, it also helps us imagine a more just and sustainable future. So in my writing, I'm primarily interested in the lives of Blackfeet women and multi-gendered peoples. I'm going to stop there and say most indigenous peoples believe that in their communities they have folks of multiple genders. Unfortunately, today I'm going to say women and men, which is kind of the Western binary. It's because I don't have time to go into the other stuff. Anyway, so I'm interested in the lives of Blackfeet women and multi-gendered peoples who I contend, after centuries of tending, cultivating, harvesting, and gardening the plant communities on the Northern Great Plains, created sustainable landscapes of abundance. And I assert that one goal of the US settler colonial project was to intentionally erase indigenous women and two-spirit peoples and their deep knowledge off the land. I also maintain that there was a concerted effort to replace the role of women as religious leaders. To quote one Jesuit missionary among the Blackfeet in the late 19th century, it was their goal to replace their wise women, and by the quote, their wise women, they meant Blackfeet wise women, with the black robe. The Northern Great Plains, I contend, was once the realm of Blackfeet and indigenous women. It was a place where they harvested plant foods and medicines. They learned how to manage the landscape using various methods to sustain plants. They utilized to engender abundance. Over generations, across thousands of years, they learned the intimate knowledge of the natural landscape. Blackfeet mythology tells of primordial feminine deities such as the moon, feather woman, and others. These deities taught humans how to relate to the larger universe. Blackfeet women were both at the center of ecological knowledge and mythological understanding. That understanding was translated into religious practice conducted by the entire tribe, where Blackfeet women served as its knowledge keepers. So another myth that is equally pervasive in US history is that indigenous people were primarily hunters. This myth has played a similar role to the land is wild to justify past and present dispossession of native land and labor. Historians claim that powerful images, such as George Catlin's famous painting of Blackfeet bison hunting in the 1830s, helped cement a public imagination of the Blackfeet as a quintessential wild people living in a hunter state. These misconceptions of the history and culture of the Blackfeet have held sway even into our own century. It is not just historians who are pushing back against these myths, but contemporary scientists are increasingly learning and interested in studying that indigenous peoples often lived on majority plant-based diets and not the meat-centered diets of the quote-unquote man the hunter stereotype. I'll say more on this in just a bit. So both the United States government and the Catholic Church worked in tandem to disrupt the lives of the Blackfeet. It began decades earlier, but it came to a tipping point in the late 19th century when the majority of Blackfeet Nation lands were annexed by the United States government. In 1888, the former territorial representative, Martin McGuinness, who by then was working for the Great Northern Railroad, brokered a deal to annex the entire northern portion of what is now Montana. He brokered the deal not with the Blackfeet, but within the halls of Congress. And by the time the Blackfeet learned of this so-called quote-unquote agreement, the deal was already done. It is not a coincidence that the state of Montana incorporated 1 year later in 1889, after almost 90% of Blackfeet Nation lands were annexed. that could not have happened without that annexation. With new reservation boundaries, Father Prando and the Jesuits stepped in to build the Holy Family Mission on the Two Medicine River a year later in 1890. It would exist for the next 50 years, from 1890 to 1940, and it would have a detrimental impact on the children and families of the Blackfeet. The Jesuits brought with them a new story. They told Blackfeet children of a male-centered universe, of a cosmic struggle and a war of worlds between two male deities, God and Satan. Lakota anthropologist B. Medicine, I should say the late Lakota anthropologist B. Medicine, argues that it was at this point in history that the Christian ethic of patriarchy, a male god, and a patrilineal kinship model with the imposition of patrilineal family names virtually eclipsed the autonomy of Native women. With the settler colonial apparatus of church and state working together, the Blackfeet landscape, natural resources, and society would never be the same. And I argue they impacted the lives of Blackfeet women more than anyone else. And I would say Two-Spirit people here as well, because at this point, there was a complete sort of erasure of Two-Spirit and other gendered people, because of the influence of the Catholic Church. The annexation of land across numerous ecosystems, the imposition of a new male-centered religion, the physical removal and deportation of families off their traditional homelands to the reservation, all dramatically impacted the lives of Blackfeet women. Annexation of land translated to stripping women of their ability to transfer traditional ecological knowledge to the next generation, which was based on specific ecosystems and landscapes, and a new male-centered religion and worldview translated to the expunging of women's centrality in Blackfeet belief systems. And the myths of indigenous lands as wild and indigenous men as hunters eclipsed indigenous women's labor and their management of the landscape. So during my grandparents' childhood, and this is my maternal grandparents, my mom's parents, during my grandparents' childhood, near the end of winter, the Blackfeet held a ceremony that marked the beginning of the new year. It's at least their new year. So Blackfeet New Year starts at the end of winter, beginning of spring. They stored dried berries, dried meat, and other dried plant foods and teas to use at this ceremony from their harvesting from the previous year. At this ceremony, they did not serve any fresh plant-based foods or meat, but this was intentional and part of its purpose. When my maternal grandparents were children, the Blackfeet religion was outlawed on the reservation by the United States government. To practice their New Year's ceremony, their family and others, quote unquote, moved their ceremonies to Easter Holy Week. At that time, both of my grandparents were attending Holy Family Mission, the Catholic mission school on the reservation. And Easter Holy Week was one of the few times that the Catholic Church and the US government allowed parents to visit their children. My grandparents' family set up camp next to the school on the Two Medicine River and held their New Year's ceremonies during the night alongside the daily Easter Holy Week activities. So my family believed that this kind of adaptation from following the cycles of the natural world to following the Catholic liturgical calendar was a small price to pay for them to continue practicing their religion. So this New Year's ceremony celebrated and acknowledged the return of a deity, thunder, and the rain that it brought. It recognized the importance of rain to replenish the life of the soil, plants, and animals on the prairies. Without rain, nothing could live in these semi-arid regions of the northern Great Plains. As part of their ceremony, each Blackfeet person, I should say towards the end of the ceremony, each Blackfeet person took an individual dried serviceberry and held it up to the sky, spoke to the thunder, and then planted it into the ground. So I'm going to just Switching now, I'm going to be talking more about the serviceberry in just a second. But I'm going to talk about the serviceberry. It's also called Juneberry, Saskatoonberry, and discuss why it's important to the Blackfeet, but also discuss how this understanding the importance of the serviceberry in Blackfeet society and their relationship with Blackfeet women and religion is really having us rethink this idea of the land as something that is wild. Okay, so the Blackfeet are not an agricultural people the way we think of agriculture today, like having cultivated farms or gardens. And in fact, the only domesticated plant that the Blackfeet ever grew was the tobacco plant. Yet they still held annual rituals at the beginning of their new year, honoring the new growing season and their most important plant-based food, which was the serviceberry. And they held ceremonies again at the end of summer when the thunder said that it would go away and return in the spring. So this ceremony highlighting the beginning of the growing season and then again having another ceremony that highlighted the end of the growing season had been conducted year after year for thousands of years by the Blackfeet. So I'm going to stop here and just add, so why are certain plants important to the Blackfeet or other indigenous groups? Almost always, the reason why a particular plant is important to that group is because it's related to religion and religious practice. It's related to some sort of story as to how it came to Earth for humans to use. So oftentimes, even though I'm going to be sharing that this particular plant was important for people to eat, the reason why it's used and it's an important part of something that is being eaten is actually because it was an important part of religion first. Although I'm going to say that differently in just a minute, so you know. So the early recorders of Blackfeet life noted that while no one had made an exhaustive study of their food, that although they had no traditions of agriculture, the Blackfeet consumed a considerable amount of vegetable food. And the serviceberry was the most important vegetable food eaten by the Blackfeet. So of course, if you had asked elders this at this time, they would have told you. And these are sort of outsiders coming in, explaining this, but that's okay. I would agree, based on my own experiences, apprenticing with my grandmother and oldest aunt, learning about Blackfeet plant knowledge, that our historic diet featured more plant-based foods than the common myth that all we did was eat bison. The Blackfeet historically ate a wide variety of root vegetables, fruits and berries, nuts and seeds, and leafy greens, plus plants that were used for medicines, teas, seasoning food, and preserving foods. So when my mother was growing up, she remembers harvesting gallons and gallons of serviceberries each summer, and it was a big family activity, and it took a lot of time in the family. So if you don't know what a serviceberry is, it's about the size of a blueberry. They grow in bushes. Sometimes they can kind of grow in trees. And when you preserve them, historically the Blackfeet preserved everything by drying it, because remember back in the day, there's like no refrigeration. Everything's dried. So the Blackfeet dried serviceberries, and when you dry them, they shrink down, and they're actually kind of smaller than, or about the size of a raisin or smaller than a raisin, and they are hard as a rock, which is why the Blackfeet call them Okanoke. That word means rock. So the same word for rock and serviceberry is the same. So my mother's family dried their berries in the sun on a large canvas tarp, and usually this was an old canvas from an old teepee or a tent, and they laid them out on the ground in the sun, and sometimes on the roof. My grandparents had like a flat roof, not a steeped roof, of their small house. They gathered enough serviceberries to fill several 50-pound cotton flour sacks, so those are like yay big. They then ate them all year round, throughout the winter, the spring, and throughout the summer until there was another crop of serviceberries. They reconstituted them by soaking them in water, or boiling them in water, or they ground them up into a flour and added them to other foods. So by the time I grew up, we still gather a lot of service berries every year, but we rely on it less and less to eat them every day. And oftentimes now when we pick them, we dry some of them, but we mostly freeze them as a way of preservation. And I'll just say as an aside, freezing a plant versus drying a plant, if you're going back to the old traditional like Blackfeet recipes of how things were used, is completely different. Because when you guys know this already, when you freeze something and you unfreeze it, it has a completely different consistency than if you were just using something that's dried. So anyway, that has changed some things. So service berries were used as food, the leaves were used as a tea, and the inner bark of its branches were used as a medicine. Its wood was used for making tools, and the very small sharpened twigs were used to pierce the ears of babies or anybody. And its long, straight branches were valued for making pipes and, back in the day, arrows. When it bloomed in the spring, it was a time to call people together to plan summer ceremonies. And its dried berries were made into soup and served in almost every ceremony, and that's true today as well. So it plays a crucial role in Blackfeet cosmology and history as well, as I mentioned before, which I'm not saying too much about. So in a recent dissertation, a nutrition studies student learned that the Blackfeet serviceberry tea, and that he actually did just study the Blackfeet serviceberry tea helped lower blood sugar, that it also served as an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. And then this same student, he's now a professor, has learned that serviceberry leaves can be used to treat certain symptoms of diabetes, such as hunger, fatigue, and even blurred vision, and that it can help delay the absorption of carbohydrates, similar to many anti-diabetes drugs today. So I'm sharing this last bit just to let you know that folks are doing research on some of these plants that indigenous people used, including this one. And this is one that, because indigenous people have such a high rate of diabetes, that you can see that in the past, when people ate this on a daily basis and used it on a daily basis, it was something that helped maintain people's blood sugar level, which is not something that people are doing today. So as I mentioned earlier, there's one domesticated plant that the Blackfeet grew, and that was tobacco. This happened before my grandparents' time. They never participated in this and only heard about it from their grandparents and their parents. In the early spring, not long after the New Year's ceremony I mentioned earlier, the Blackfeet used to clear plots along creeks to create a garden to grow their tobacco. First, they went to serviceberry bushes and cut away all the dead wood. They coppiced or they pruned the bushes, and that stimulated new growth, as you know, and helped create the straight branches that they liked to use for making pipes or, back in the day, again, arrows. They then took the cut branches from the serviceberries and they took them over to the garden plot and they burned them along with all of the prairie grasses. The Blackfeet then flattened out that area of the garden plot and they mixed the soil with the ash. And before they planted the tobacco seeds, they held a ritual that honored the deities of tobacco and to ensure a healthy crop. So they mixed the tobacco seeds. I don't know if you've ever seen a tobacco seed. It's teeny tiny. It's like even smaller than a poppy seed. They mixed the tobacco seeds with a mixture of ground up serviceberries, dried serviceberries, and animal manure and water, and they made these kind of like little balls, and they would drop them into the ground. They'd take a stick and plant them in the ground. And one of the rituals that happens as part of the tobacco ceremony back in the day, one of the deities shared how to do this with them and told the Blackfeet that if they did this, they would enrich the soil. One of the reasons I'm sharing this is because there's kind of this relationship with serviceberries and tobacco, as well, as you can tell, in terms of the way that they would manage serviceberry bushes to be more abundant was also connected to the way that they would plant their tobacco gardens. And because of because of commercial tobacco, that's not done anymore, that kind of landscape management practice, to a large extent. Okay. So my grandfather used to delight us children with stories of the deities who took care of the tobacco gardens, even though we didn't grow tobacco gardens anymore. The deities enjoyed singing and dancing, he would always tell us, and they would stomp on the insects in the tobacco garden while they were dancing. So even though in my childhood tobacco was store-bought and we used commercial tobacco and no one really grew it anymore, I still learned about the deities who helped take care of the plants, whether they were domesticated or cultivated, and learned why they were important to the Blackfeet. And I also learned that these stories and the actions of the deities were shared by grandparents to grandchildren, not just in my family, but in others. So when my grandmother grew up, she also learned to sing the songs of different deities who helped with the maintenance of serviceberry bushes and others. So once while I was doing research at a natural history museum, I came across the fossils that Blackfeet women used while they were singing to these deities. The museum called them quote-unquote worm stones because they were supposed to get rid of insects or get rid of worms. But they're not really, they're not stones, they're actually fossils of ammonite. And so similar to the buffalo stone that I mentioned earlier, also not a stone, it's a fossil, worm stones were used to change the behavior of insects and other pests in the same way that buffalo stones were used to change the behavior of bison. So one of the landscape management practice tools that Blackfeet women used was their relationship with these deities, the deities that helped with the growth of plants and deities that helped change the behavior of pests and other insects. And in addition to the basics, like sort of transplanting plants from one location to the other or using fertilizer or pruning, it was really important to maintain these ritual practices as well as part of landscape practices. So I'm often asked which came first, right? Ecological knowledge and then religious practice, or religious practice and then ecological knowledge. And I'll just say this, it depends on the day. I'll give you a different answer. I think earlier I gave you one answer. So I'm not really sure at this point. But I do know, I'll just say this, I do know that Blackfeet women understood ecological processes, and they had a relationship with the divine as well. They understood a lot more than I can say today. They understood seasonal cycles, climate and weather patterns, plant and animal behavior, and these were incorporated into their religious knowledge, the mythology, and their religious practices. They also understood that insects were pests, right? And that they could do harm to both domesticated plant species and cultivated plants, and that knowledge was also incorporated into their cosmology and religious practice. The same is true with soil health. I can kind of go on and on. There's a lot of examples of different ways that the way that people had different landscape management practices, what they did kind of, quote unquote, in the real world was always connected to religion and religious practice. But they also knew how to change the landscape they lived in. They did this through anthropogenic fire, collecting and planting seeds, using fertilizer, transplanting plants from one place to another, pruning, as I mentioned before, coppicing plants, and other methods to increase the abundance of plant-based foods and medicines. So for example, I'll give you a quick example. There's actually it's now a town in southern Alberta, but it was a place before. It's kind of in the middle of this really arid place of southern Alberta, and it was a place where Blackfeet women went there and transplanted not just serviceberries, but a lot of different berries and different types of plants that they used for medicine and for food. And the Blackfeet called that place Many Berries, and there's now actually a town in southern Alberta called Many Berries. Not really a town, it's basically a bar. Sorry. You drive through there. But when you're there, you can kind of see like you're in the middle of a desert, right? And you can kind of see north is the Cypress Hills, and kind of to the south and to the side is the Sweetgrass Hills. And these were the kinds of places that were created on the landscape back in the day that have fallen into disuse. but they still exist as places sometimes, or definitely as place names or stories. So toward the end of summer, when the service berries are ripe, the Blackfeet hold another ceremony. It marks the end of summertime and the potential that rain will be leaving, and the beginning of the preparation for the long winter. So, and unlike the ceremony held at the end of winter, when all the food is dried from the previous year, in this particular ceremony, all the food is fresh. Fresh berries, fresh meat, fresh mild mint, everything that has been recently harvested. The holy woman who leads this ceremony fasts for several days. She does not eat or drink. She's only allowed to drink each night what my grandmother used to call muddy water, but it was basically water that was infused with minerals and mineral salts. So part of the purpose of this ceremony was to express gratitude, right, for a good year, for your healthy family that lived throughout the year, for the rain, for the abundant supply of plant-based foods and medicines. So in certain ways, it was like a fall harvest festival, celebrating the harvest and its supply and its surplus, enough that you could share with your family or trade with your neighbors. And at the end of this ceremony, the holy woman breaks her fast by eating a bowl of soup made from fresh service berries. And similar to the New Year's ceremony that celebrated new growth, this ceremony, like I said, celebrated the harvest. So again, as I mentioned, the Blackfeet were not agricultural, the way we define agriculture today, but they did utilize the landscape. They had landscape management practices. They understood the seasons and embedded these within their ceremonial practices. They understood the natural cycles of the ecosystems that they lived in and its plant growth. And these ceremonies celebrated abundance and how to maintain abundance. So I want to end here with a comment. So, as Indigenous peoples, it is difficult to set aside our history of colonization, dispossession of land, deportation, and genocide, because our history is so much part of our present-day lives. But the thing that is often the most shocking to Indigenous people is how the United States, after taking our land, has destroyed our land. And this was mentioned earlier by previous speakers. A lot of Indigenous people today who visit US-defined wilderness lands or wilderness areas or even national parks do not often see beautiful landscapes. They see land that was once habitable, cultivated, domesticated, and hospitable that has now become feral. As I stated, because of the lack of Indigenous landscape management practices. And as I stated earlier, we need to confront these myths. We need to confront these myths of what the wild is, what the wild isn't, and how people think about land differently and have utilized and used land differently. And I think that myths like wilderness, as it's defined in the Wilderness Act, that we need to rethink those and, as I mentioned earlier, kind of have a more honest assessment of the past and present. And I think that that will help us reimagine or imagine a more just and sustainable future. So thank you very much.
Time for questions. I can't see.
Or comments.
Anybody see a hand up?
Oh, now we can see you. When we're up here and there's just the light, we can't see you at all. It's just like you guys are just darkness. And when they raise the lights, then we can kind of see you.
Okay.
I just wanted to ask if there was any concept of wilderness then for Indigenous people. I mean, it's a big land that was inhabited and loved and cared for, but are you implying there's just no wilderness concept?
Yes. I think John Potter mentioned this earlier as well. Yeah, there was no concept of wilderness. There's not a word for wild. I mean, it's a lot of indigenous folks, including the Blackfeet, it's hard to find a word that translates to that. But I would argue this. There is such a thing as land that's set aside from humans. And almost always what that is land that is sacred landscapes. And almost always that is, for example, a place where a deity lives, a place where a deity lives part of the year. And so the land is set aside from human use because it is holy land or sacred land. That's not the same thing as wilderness. There's also land that is set aside because of death, the same way we do today, right? I mean, we set aside cemeteries and we don't build there or we just go visit there. Those are set aside spaces. Some people would say those are sacred places as well. Indigenous people also had set aside places like that where there may have been something where there is a reason why human interaction, usually connected to death, people are buried there. There may have been a battle there and people died there, and those are set aside. Again, that's not exactly the same idea as wilderness. Yeah. It's a good question, though, to think about.
Here you go.
As a longtime lover of harvesting berries, I'm just so curious about what you know about the actual practices of, service berries are on small bushes or very tall bushes, and I'm imagining mothers and children, but baskets, like just any information you have about the actual physical process of collecting the service berries.
Today or like back in the day?
Both?
Okay. So, I mean, once there was cotton, and usually that was back in the day was cotton flour sacks. That was used as the method of picking, taking those out and filling those and picking. Today, a lot of times we use, again, this passed down through the generations. We use pillowcases, which is kind of the same thing. Like I said, people don't collect as much now as they used to. People still collect the service berries because it's used in ceremonies. Eaten every day, not so much, so there's not a lot collected. Dried, not so much anymore. In terms of preservation, almost everybody freezes them now. Yeah, I mean, I would just say it's almost kind of the same, only different. We still go out in large groups of people. Like, people don't do this by themselves. You almost always bring everybody. And today, it's all social media, right? I mean, you get on your Facebook family. Does everybody have a Facebook family group? Like, we have a Facebook family group. And you just get on and like, I'm going to such and such, be there at such and such. And everybody shows up. Yeah, so same, kind of the same, only different, yeah.
Is there a special way that you have to know when to pick serviceberry? I know personally that if serviceberry is picked too late, you end up with a lot of seed and very little berry.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things, so in my family, because we do a lot of plant gathering, you start going out in springtime, early springtime, because you're not just picking service berries, you're picking lots of other stuff. And so while you're out picking other stuff, you're just looking. So there's a lot of just looking at plants to see where they are. What do they look like? What do they look like? What do they look like? Okay, now they're ready, kind of thing. And with service berries, as I mentioned, that's one of those. There's a couple of plants that I'd call like super plants. that the Blackfeet have, meaning they use every part of the plant, right? They use the flower, they use the fruit, they use the seed, they use the leaves, they use the stems, they use the roots. There's several plants like that, and you have to pick those at different seasons as they're growing. So you're usually out. I mean, that's how you know when they're ready to pick, because you've seen it week after week after week, and then people just go, okay, now it's ready. That's why the family Facebook group, it works really well, because then people will take pictures and they'll be like, is it ready yet? Like, okay, we're gonna go out now. So yes, I'll just say in terms of it getting seedy, sometimes you do want it seedy for other reasons. For example, if it's going to be used like back in the day with tobacco ceremonies, they did want it a little more mealy, like when it gets to the end, because you're going to be using it like in fertilizer versus eating it. So there's still a use, even if it's overripe. Yeah, that's a good question.
One more question, if you have it.
Rosalyn, it's Dan. I know you can't see it.
I can't see you, Dan.
But you probably recognize my voice. I'm just so appreciative and fascinated by your critique of Western notions of the wild and wilderness. And I appreciate the little dig you made at the opportunities for solitude component of the Wilderness Act, when that's so different than the indigenous perspectives of what those lands meant. But in terms of just sort of pragmatic or practical things, I mean, setting aside wilderness has been one of the few ways in kind of the rapacious settler colonial exploitation of all the lands that presenting some lands at least were prevented from that. And so what do you see as, and I know there's some different movements with the land back movement, things what are some positive ways of moving forward that would still protect some of those lands from the kind of exploitation that's been so typical of everything else, but would return indigenous peoples to those lands or co-management or what do you see as some productive ways to move forward with that?
Yeah, no, that's a great, so just to let folks know, I ran into Dan at lunchtime and I was like, dude, I'm giving a talk. He was down down getting food. So, okay, that's a great comment / question. Okay, so I'm often asked, because I do seriously critique the myths in American history. And I think that we really do need to end some of those myths. As I said, I think they are dangerous. And they can be used by either side of the political spectrum. That's why myths should not be perpetuated. Okay, having said that, I still think that we should be setting aside land, absolutely, from capitalism and from consumerism, which is what the Wilderness Act does and which national parks do as well. So I think that we do have a system in place right now in the United States where we are setting aside land, and we do have a lot of, I can't remember how many, is it 111 million acres that's wilderness lands right now? We have a lot, but so I think that that's good. I think setting aside land from capitalism is absolutely necessary, and that we need to have more. So I'm not critiquing that, I'm just critiquing the myth behind it, and the myth behind why we are setting aside those lands, and what we think we're doing. So I would just take a step back from that for just a sec and say, oftentimes when we set aside land 100 years ago, like national parks, and we are saying that this is like the epitome of like this empty landscape, the epitome of wilderness, it's actually the exact opposite, right? That is the epitome of landscape management practices by indigenous people for thousands of years. What we're setting aside when we set aside a national park is what I would argue women did, right? They created this landscape that we look at and we say is amazing. Nature didn't do that. Nature didn't do that. It didn't happen by being left alone. Okay, so today, some of our conservation management practices is to leave nature alone. And I think that that is not the way we should be managing land. Because what we think we are looking at from the past and saying, this is what we're conserving and we want it to look like this did back then, that's human-created landscape. And there's nothing wrong, I would argue, with landscape management, even when we set aside land that we call now wilderness and national parks. And again, like I said, I think it's important. We should be setting aside that stuff from commercialism and from capitalism. But that doesn't mean that humans still can't manage that land. And I think when we leave it alone to nature, that's when, like I said, a lot of indigenous elders, they're just like, that's feral. Like, it's gone crazy. You know, it's a mess. If you talk to elders, they don't see, like I said, they don't see beautiful landscape. They see feral land that when it has been managed and now it's not managed. So, no, so I think I totally agree with you. We need to set aside land, and we need to set aside more land that needs to be separate. But again, we should get rid of the myth as to why we're setting that aside, which is this myth of that it's wild, that it's empty, that it's this, you know, we're recreating this Garden of Eden. All of those founding myths of the United States are just wrong, and they're incorrect. And like I said, they're kind of insulting to indigenous people who've been here for thousands of years. So, well, thanks for coming, Dan, and others. Thank you, everybody. This was very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
That was great. I should mention that there's a piece of land, 40 or 50,000 acres right now, up in the Upper Blackfoot, that the Bureau of Land Management has acquired ownership of, and they're looking to decide what they'll do with it. It's pretty wild. And to their credit, in the process of determining what do we do with this untrammeled land, well, it's trammeled, but it's not developed, they've brought in the Salish community because it is traditional Salish lands, and they're asking them to help figure out how to protect it going forward. So that's a step in the right direction. But I digress. I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about our next group. Healing Grounds, Climate Justice and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Agriculture. That's the title of this talk, and the title of the book by our next guest, Liz Carlisle. Liz is going to tell us about creative farming methods that are steadily transforming and restoring the ecosystem. She'll be joined by Latrice Tatsey. She's a leader in the Blackfeet effort to bring back the buffalo to Montana, and Nikiko Masamoto, a California Central Valley farmer who is using farming techniques developed thousands of years ago in Asia. So with no further ado, I'm hoping they're standing over here in the corner, Liz Carlisle, Latrice Tatsey, and Nikiko Masamoto. Hello, Latrice.
Hello.
Hello.
We got lost.
It happens. So this is up to you guys. How do you want to kick it off? Latrice, you're going to start?
I guess, let's do this.
Okay. Latrice Tatsey, everybody.
I think we're opening with the film clip. We're opening with the film clip.
Do I have to press that button?
Them. Those ways were gone, and they had to go forward.
A year after the first Blackfeet buffalo herd was rounded up, the tribe decided on a new approach to bring back Inni. They kept a small number of calves from the first herd, bought some new ones, and raised them all in a confined area. The idea was to create a new herd that would better respect fences before letting them out into bigger pastures. This attempt included more hands-on management, like ear tagging and giving them feed, and opened up more of the management process to the community, including volunteers from Blackfeet Community College.
When I went to work at Blackfeet Community College, I would take my students down there, and we would help feed, we would help, settle the buffalo into their new environment.
This is a very positive thing for our people. It's exciting for a lot of our younger kids to come up and observe these animals.
But what was happening, all this was going on, is a lot of our students were so disconnected from our old ways, and when I got to be around these animals, it just gave them a sense of belonging or a sense of who they are as tribal people. I remember one time I asked a girl, she was having some challenges, high risk, if you will, and I asked her, I'll give you a research assignment this summer. I want you to go out and monitor the grass species these animals are eating in the morning and in the evening. Well, she did that, but what come out of that was something that I didn't expect. What she learned by observing those animals was how their social structure, how these cows can leave one or two mothers in charge to babysit all the babies while the rest of them go off to graze. She observed all these social behaviors they have. And what it helped her to do is reconnect with herself and who she was, I guess, and moved on to do a lot better things than she would have if she'd stayed on that path she was on. But it was all because of observing those animals and their social structure, the responsibilities they took. That's where she got that from.
Despite all the good these animals were bringing, there were still complaints from ranchers and landowners about buffalo trespassing and breaking fences. Then, after 8 years of this herd, around 2006, a new Blackfeet Tribal Council leadership came into power, and because of these complaints, the council abruptly decided to sell most of the herd.
That is a little bit a tougher pill to swallow for me. But by the time the second herd was sold, we had enough support from the people in general to do this again. I knew there was more support than there was when the first herd was sold.
Bringing back the bison is an idea of the blood.
Okinistuna Donegu Neskamaki, Buffalo Stone Woman. My English name is Latrice Tatsy. It's a little emotional for me to watch that film with my father. And thinking about relationships to the land and relationships to animals. And when we think about management, or when we think about people, we got to understand the connectivity, the relationships that we have. And whether we look from the above beings below or the below beings above, everything is interconnected. There's reciprocity. You can't take one thing out of the system without affecting other things. And so when I look at the return of buffalo, I look at the return of culture. Because when you have something that was taken away from people, you have a piece of their identity who was stripped away. Growing up with my father, I watched him manage the buffalo herd, but we grew up on a cattle ranch. I grew up on a cattle ranch. He would show me all the buffalo jumps on our land. He would show me the rock cairns where they would run the buffalo. He would show me the teepee rings that are tied to where we live, which is called Running Crane Agency. He would explain the history of the land. And I would always think, we're thinking of this in the past, and as a kid, I didn't really understand what my role would be growing up. And I got my Indian name, Buffalo Stone Woman, and like I said, I grew up on a cattle ranch, and I was like, oh my goodness, why buffalo? I'm a cattle person, I raised a bum calf, I have horses. But then when it really come into me maturing and growing into my name, I really understood it was about the role in the relationship that I had been brought up in with my father growing up. It was always about the land. And so that's something he's instilled in me. He would bring students out to the land. He would bring people into the mountains. And as I grew up, I did those same things. I graduated from the university with my bachelor's and my master's degree, but I always knew I had to give back to my community. And what did that mean to me? It was what I seen my mom and my dad doing, bringing people back out onto the land and reinvigorating those relationships. And for me, that is the biggest key piece, is because a lot of us are missing the relationship to land. We look at land as it is a system, but we forget our role in land. As humans, we are a part of it. We evolved with it. We evolved with nature, just like buffalo have evolved with these grasslands and their grazing behaviors and their roles as keystone species, such as beaver. But when you look at the relationship these animals have to land, it also talks about the relationship that people have to land. When we look at indigenous people, when we look at Blackfeet, Omscopy, Piikani, when we look at our sister bands in Canada, we think about the relationships they had and how that was tied to ceremony and how that was tied to their ways of living and management systems. And so today, as an indigenous woman in my mid-30s, I think about it that I'm relearning the relationships that my ancestors had learned from the four-leggeds. And now I look at my relationship, and the four-leggeds took pity on us two-leggeds in our creation stories. And now I see it as our responsibility as the two-leggeds to take care of the four-leggeds now. And how do we do that? We do that by understanding what their relationship is. What is their relationship to ecological functionality? What are we managing for when it comes to resources? Are we managing for monetary value? Are we monitoring for ecological functionality? Are we managing for it to be in its most pristine ecological state? And so when I work with people, when I look, whether it's with bison management or cattle management, I put that steward relationship back in there when I'm working with any producer. What is your relationship to that land? What is your reciprocity? What are you giving back to that land because that land is giving you something? Though that soil, those microbial communities are growing plants. Those plants are then feeding your livestock and the bison and the other wildlife. The health of the livestock or the wildlife are taking care of the people, and the people's health depends on that. The economics of our society depends on the health of our land. And right now, we need to be better caretakers and reevaluate what our stewardship responsibilities are. So when I work with my producers, I say, what are we managing for? We are dealing with climate change. How do we change the way we manage our grazing system? Let's look at bison. They would utilize a piece of land, but they would let it rest. Our plant communities, whether they be for medicinal or spiritual use, evolved with grazing, but they also evolved with rest. Just as people do, if we continually keep going and going, we're gonna burn out. And so we see that happening to our land too. So when we think about things, what is our relationship? What is our responsibility? And so that's what I want to leave with my, until Liz asks me some more questions, is what is our responsibility and what is our relationship to the land? Thank you.
I feel so much abundance. My name is Nikiko Masumoto. I'm a Yonsei Japanese American, fourth generation Japanese American from California. And I'm going to share a little bit about an entry point for me into farming, but we also have a little clip from a documentary from almost a decade ago called Changing Season that will give you a little glimpse into my life in California.
It was in 1948. The family was renting some vineyards at that time. My father said, in America, you don't get ahead unless you own property. So he went out and found this crummy 40 acres here. Only half of it you could farm. The rest was this mountain of hardpan rock. Because it was worthless, it was precisely available to a poor immigrant family because it was cheap. So he bought this farm, put a down payment on it, went back and told my grandmother and grandfather that I bought a farm. He told my grandmother, and my grandmother was furious. She goes, "You bought a farm? You buy things in America? That's wrong because they take things away from you in America." And she was absolutely right, because she had witnessed this happen with her own personal life. So she refused to go. My dad said, "Look, we're going to the farm tonight." And she says, "No, I'm not going. I'm not going." So my dad gave her an ultimatum. By sundown, we are going to this farm with or without you. My grandfather was already happy. He was already waiting in the car. So then my dad went up and waited in the car, and they waited for the hour. They saw the sunset, and then quietly, my grandmother came out of the house carrying this black suitcase that had the stenciled number of our family from relocation camp. And she quietly got in the car, and they went to the new farm in silence. That's how we started our farm.
I am so struck by Latrice, this echoes of our father connection that we haven't talked about much, but I just wanted to name that. So to share a little bit about my path, I just want to begin after, and then we'll get to Liz's beautiful reading and then conversation. I wanted to share a poem that I wrote during the pandemic, and I wrote it when I was feeling so alone. And as we're talking about the power of relationship with each other and the land, I feel very honored to get to read this. And this poem was just published, my first published poem ever, in a collection called Letters to Home of writings by Japanese American LGBTQ folks that was just published this year. So this is called A Long Welcome, and it's essentially me trying to welcome myself home. You are welcome here. You who are present, you who are trying to multitask, you who are powering through a hard day, a hard week, a hard year. You who are full of excitement and curiosity, you who carry the unknown and unsure. You are welcome. You who are familiar, friends, family, strangers, new and old, you are welcome too. You who come with dreams of dancing on summer nights, of sweat and sequins, of reaching your palm to the sky. Was it in prayer or getting down with your bad self? Or were you reaching to pick the perfect peach? You who come with songs of love and liberation dancing on your tongue, you are welcome. You who come with enduring hearts, who are tired, who are missing someone, who have stood at the bedside, who have risen in the middle of the night, who have given the best care you could. You who have lost someone you love. You who have lost someone you never knew. You who are seeking renewal and connection. You who have given birth. You who are healers and brujas. You who are in need of rest or a vacation. You are welcome. You who share roots. You who are queer in the country, you who are queer in the city, you who are melanin blessed, you whose grandparents or great-grandparents loved and lived from the land, you who know the scent of home by heart. You whose ancestors endured, whose ancestors survived, whose ancestors' lands were stolen, whose ancestors were forced to work on stolen land, you who have lost your ancestors, you who invite your ancestors home every year, maybe to dance obon-odori under swaying lanterns. You who come from lineages of workers and dreamers and makers and stewards, you whose stories I have yet to learn, you who come with longing, you who come with offerings, you who come with joy, you who work daily to make something special and meaningful of your life, you who seek justice, you who keep hand-me-down recipes, you who are raising our children to love themselves. You who are seeking healing and relief. You who know failure. You who keep our kitchens full of our grandmother's stories. You who bake pies and cookies and make preserves and keep seeds and ferment vegetables. And you who wash our dishes and clean up our shit. You who I love fiercely, you who I do not yet know how to love. You and you and you. You are welcome here. You are welcome here. We are welcome here. Looking so forward to sharing more.
Wow. I'm Liz Carlisle. I study and write about organic and regenerative agriculture. And I thought I knew what those things were because I've been doing this for about 15 years now. But conversations with these two incredibly powerful and wise women and two others who aren't with us physically today but are very much with us in spirit really changed the way I thought about what those things are. So I'm going to read a short passage here from Healing Grounds. As researchers have now known for decades, the majority of the carbon stored in forests around the world isn't sequestered in the trees, but in the soil below. Globally, soils constitute a carbon repository some 3 times as large as the amount of carbon stored in all the plants on Earth. This soil carbon sink is also 3 times larger than the amount of carbon currently in the atmosphere. And there's good reason to think that, with the help of plants, our soils could be holding even more carbon, a lot more. The main reason soils aren't already holding more carbon is agriculture, or more precisely, industrially farmed monocultures. Over thousands of years, and especially the last 200 or so, carbon once stored in soils has been released to the atmosphere through overgrazing, plowing, and loss of soil fertility, as soils have been mined for their nutrients and left bare between plantings, prone to erosion. Researchers estimate that some 133 gigatons of carbon have been released as a result, approximately 8% of total global soil carbon stocks. And so advocates have started asking whether a different kind of agriculture might be able to repay the debt and put some of that carbon back. And I'm one of those advocates. I've been interested in this idea of putting some of that carbon back as well. But I was also curious, is this a kind of agriculture that we have to invent newly? The term regenerative agriculture is kind of new on the block, or might there in fact be some precedent that could help people trying to create such farming systems now? And I had an inkling of such a history, having studied the organic movement, but it was the kind of situation where I knew just enough to realize that there was a lot I didn't know. And to my amazement, I found that practices commonly promoted within regenerative agriculture circles as new innovations had in fact been used for many hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of years, as we've just been hearing about, not just in faraway ancient civilizations, but continuously, and right here on the North American continent. Accompanying these practices are sophisticated analyses of soil health, as well as guidelines for stewarding it. Some of these regenerative farmers, though I came to understand them by other terms that they themselves used, were indigenous to these lands. Others had migrated here, bringing knowledge and seeds with them. But once I began learning to recognize the signature of their influence on the North American landscape, I started seeing it everywhere, in places that few agricultural researchers ventured to look. Vacant lots, immigrant neighborhoods, Native American reservations. Regenerative agriculture kept periodically popping up like a desert superbloom after a spring rain. And this left me with a pointed, haunting question. Why weren't these regenerative farmers more securely established? If putting down roots was the key to a climate-friendly food system, what was preventing these people with regenerative farming know-how from doing so? Or had they been uprooted? At this point, I realized that I needed to examine the story of U.S. agriculture, a story I thought I knew, through a lens other than my own. And I became intensely curious about what indigenous farmers and communities of color might teach me about how to work toward healing on the land. And when I started asking the question this way, a rich landscape of regenerative agriculture began to come into view. I spoke with indigenous Montanans working to restore native prairie and bring home their bison relatives. I talked to returning generation Black farmers reaching back to their African heritage to inform new agroforestry initiatives. A Chicana soil ecologist, herself the child of farm workers, showed me the results of her research with immigrant Mexican and Hmong farmers in California's Central Valley, whose highly diverse small farms were teeming with beneficial fungi. The more I learned, the more I came to see that regenerative agriculture was neither a relic nor a fantasy. It had always been here, but on the margins. Pushed to the edges of industrial agriculture, these practices had been sustained by people, pushed to the edges of society. And this was not just a story about regeneration, but also one about liberation. And the two were powerfully intertwined. As I learned from farmers, scholars, and advocates who had spent lifetimes digging into these histories, some of them looking into their own families' pasts, the regenerative farming traditions of their ancestors had been suppressed, but never fully snuffed out. Carefully tended in the gardens of the enslaved and the murals of the landless, these traditions had provided both material subsistence and another form of sustenance that was difficult to put into words. There had been centuries of this work, seeds braided into hair and smuggled across borders, passed down generation to generation. Bison and their human relatives confined to reserves, dreaming of reunion on their ancestral lands. Milpas on the edges of farm fields, New Year's meals of black-eyed peas, networks for sharing harvest labor. All these practices had persisted, despite the confines of structural racism. Might this moment of climate crisis be their time to blossom? So we're going to share a little bit of a conversation here. We've all had a chance to speak with each other. As I mentioned, it was such an incredible privilege to interview both of these women and feature them in Healing Grounds. There are 4 stories of 4 incredible women, so half of this book is really guided by the wisdom and stories of Latrice and Nikiko. And I wanted to draw out just a little bit more of that in conversation here, starting with you, Latrice. Oh my goodness, and to see your dad in that clip, incredibly powerful. So I first reached out to you when I was researching this book because I was interested in learning more about regenerative grazing and this idea that in contrast to most contemporary cattle operations, native herbivores on this continent moved across the landscape and grazed in a way that actually stimulated vegetation to regrow and build up soil carbon. And I know one aspect of your work has been studying the ecological significance of the ini, the buffalo, the bison. And at the same time, another aspect of your work in regenerative grazing comes from your lifelong history on your family's cattle ranch and the life of managing cows. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what you've learned about what regenerative grazing means at Blackfeet Nation in relationships with both of these animals and going forward, building up soil carbon and land health in the face of climate change.
For me, what regenerative grazing means is it's the relationship to the land and to the people and utilizing the resources. Because we've been going through climate change or changes in climate, however you want to view that, or we've been seeing our prairie pothole kettles, everything just starting to be impacted by overgrazing, and it become evident that our tribalists, our ceremonialists were losing access to these plant communities that they needed. And I was like, okay, there's is a relationship to land and to grazing, and so the more I started to really delve in and look at what's been going on, I realized that our disconnect to the land and to the relationship had caused a lot of issues. And when we were agrarian practices were pushed on us, and then it was the fences, and then holding your cattle and livestock in these areas for long periods of time. And so when I was looking at it and relearning how bison graze, because I had to go and research that. I had to relearn that information. And so when I was going back out and I was realizing like the evolutionary process of grasslands and buffalo grazing, and that it was that utilization, but it was that rest period, I realized at that point the land was not receiving enough rest. And because it wasn't receiving enough rest, our plant communities are suffering. And so my job now is to work with producers on conservation practices to help build up our plant communities, and looking at it from, I always say from the top or from the down, the soil up, because we need those healthy soil communities for our plant communities. And when we're looking at losses of soil moisture, we have to look at, we don't have as much plant abundance and plant cover. And so really, how do we put the relationship back in management, and how do we make the producers have that knowledge base? So, because everybody wants to do the right thing. When I talk with my producers, they all want to do the right thing. And so it's helping them and giving them the tools to make those choices and decisions when it comes to their operations. And so that's how I see myself at this point, as being a bridge and a tool in my positions to help them have those better relationships with their land, because regardless, they are the expert out on that land, and I'm just here to help them make better management choices, not tell them what to do. And so that's how I really view my relationships with the producers, just meeting them where they're at
in helping them move forward in their decision making.
Thank you. Nikiko, your poem is such a powerful articulation of what it means to belong. And I know your dad, Moss, who we got to hear from a little bit in that clip, is widely known as an early leader in the organic movement in California, and the heirloom peaches from your family farm are prized by some of the most high-profile chefs in the country, as well as my own family. But there's another aspect to your family's work to invest in your soil and your land that dates back to the courage and resilience of your grandparents and great-grandparents, as we also heard a little bit about in that clip. So can you say a little bit more about those generational connections that infuse your work at Matsumoto Family Farm and the way you think about regeneration and what it means to be a regenerative presence on the land?
Yeah, thank you. I want to start by just calling and naming. I identify as Yonsei, fourth generation, so my great-grandparents immigrated from Japan, and they worked the same soil that I get to work on our farm. And I, every day, feel this profound connection through the land, through the grapevines and peach trees that are still alive and producing that they planted or that were already planted and that they worked. And at the same time, 4 generations is nothing compared to Latrice, your family on the land. So I say that as an entry point of humility, and also imagining if 4 generations is so profound for me, what could we all non-native people learn from the folks who are still here tending to our lands? So that's really striking to me today, especially in all of the echoes, Latrice, between you and I had never seen that film clip before, just thinking about love, the complex love for fathers in this work. So I'll try not to say too much, but I think the one thing that is rising for me today to talk about is my entry point into returning to our family's farm, because I left for college thinking I would never even come back to our region. I think this is a common rural thing, common thing of, I don't know if it's rebellion and or part of the hidden agenda that is not meant as malicious, but at least I think I received in school that success was always somewhere urban, that staying home was not the path to success. So I kind of had to undo some of those myths. We were talking about how powerful myths are in shaping earlier. I had to undo those myths. And part of coming home, there is a joyous side of the flavors and the colors and the scents and the textures. And there's also a profound grief that I feel like I had to walk through and still live with. In the clip, you hear our family, like 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast, we were forcibly removed from our lands. Same story of the United States, different time period, different tactics, but I hear it as the same story. And so for me, in the excitement around regenerative agriculture, and I feel a surge in people asking questions about ancestral knowledge, for those of us, I'll just speak for me, we have to understand that it's not all rosy. And I carry guilt, I carry shame that I don't know more about my ancestors' traditions with the land because it was taken. Our lands were taken. The maps drawn of where Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from map onto our farms in the early 1900s. So to me, that has been this profound beauty both encompassing the sadness and also this badass, resilient survival and just straight up celebration of juice running down your chin. That is the life I'm so lucky to be part of.
Amazing. Yes, we're sharing 2 microphones here, so. I actually wanted to ask a question to both of you that really speaks to the larger theme of this festival, which is finding our place in nature, the power of story. And I'd love to hear each of you reflect on why stories matter in the work that you do. What is the role of stories in regenerating soils and food systems and ties to land? You both have so much incredible, deep technical knowledge as land managers, as someone who advises land managers with a graduate degree in science, but you both are really brilliant in how you weave story into the work that you do. And so I'd love to hear a little bit of your reflection on, how are stories a piece of what you do? Why do stories matter as we think about confronting climate change and the role of landscapes in climate change?
For me, stories are important. Even like when I was a kid, we'd hear Napi and the Bullberry, because all those stories were tied to ecological knowledge. And so as a kid, I thought I was hearing these crazy stories, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Napi is this trickster, he's this character, but there was this piece of information that was always tied to it. And I remember when I started studying the Blackfeet calendar stick, and I was researching on every science-based website, what Blackfeet calendar stick, and I couldn't find anything. And then the closest I got was the Mayan calendar stick. And so I started asking around to tribal elders, and so what ended up happening is I would go visit with one elder, they would send me to the next elder, so I realized the way that I was getting this information was through story. And I couldn't just go ask a specific question because they weren't going to give me that direct answer. I had to hear the whole story and how it came about that way. Because if I wouldn't have heard that story, I wouldn't have realized how interconnected things were. When I was studying, any buffalo, I was, asking these questions, and so I would research what I could, but I had to go back to the elders, and I would have to go reach back out to the bison or the buffalo managers to ask those questions, because what I was asking wasn't in books, because what I realized is the questions that I was asking was more relationship based. And so I had to go out to those people to get that information. And even when I go with my friends who are younger and to go pick plants, and we're talking about it, they tell the story about the plant, and they have these songs that they sing. And so I understand that I'm not just going out with them to pick a plant. There's a whole process with it. And so even when I go hunting with my dad, it's just not going hunting, it's putting out an offering. It's about that reciprocity. You're not just going to take something. You have to give in order to just take something. So for me, it was about understanding that balance of always making sure that you reciprocate and so having that instilled in me, even when I go out and dig a soil pit, when I was going out with my students, we would put down tobacco. And we would say, we are taking something to study, and we will return this soil back to you. But it was because you have to realize so many times the land is just extracted from, but we don't necessarily put things back. We don't have that relationship. So for me, those stories tie me back to who we are as Indigenous people and really hone me in. And so as a young Indigenous woman, I had to go back and relearn who I was. And it gave me that empowerment in going hunting with my dad and being on Bullshoe Mountain, Spotted Eagle Mountain, and just all those, and hearing those stories as a young kid. I was thinking, why am I up here during Thanksgiving and eating a frozen piece of turkey meat while everybody else is, gathered around looking nice and gathered around a warm table? But I realized that really helped set me up for who I am today, because those are experiences that I can share, and my son's up there somewhere in the audience, and he went hunting with my dad. He went back there for a week. And so I don't mean to get emotional, but it's this generational thing that we got to pass down. And so my dad shared those stories with my son. He showed my son where those places were because, you know, I can't do that. You know, I'm working full time, but my dad makes the time to still do those things for my children because he understands the importance of those stories and that connectivity because, you know, in the next 20 years, my dad won't be up in the mountains, but my son will be in his 30s, and he'll be taking his kids back there. And so that's how I think of it, is the stories connect us to who we are and to our relationships, whether they're written down or whether they're told orally. Those stories are important to who we are as Indigenous people. And when I look at the audience, I want you to all think we're all Indigenous to somewhere on this continent. It might not be this land continent here, but we're all Indigenous to somewhere. So remember that. Remember that, and to own who you are, and to always be proud of who you are, because sometimes we let that pride be taken away from us. But always be proud of your background and who you come from, because those stories are tied to who you are in your DNA as well.
I don't know if I need to say anything that's so beautiful and so generous for you to share, Latrice. So many echoes. You know, I think about stories as a human technology of meaning making, and possibly the most important piece of technology for definitely my entry back to the land. And I think, Latrice, you are just so beautifully inviting us to marinate with, like, the invitation of deep relationship. Like, what does it really mean to be in deep relationship? And one of the things I love you sharing about visiting elders, and you said you ask a question and you have to, there's a whole roundabout way that so deeply resonates with me. And it makes me think about one of the power of story, one aspect is stories always imagine a listener. So like even in the very container of a story is a relationship. Even if it's in the written page, it's an imagined reader. If it's an oral tradition, it's in each other's presence. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Yeah, I could sit here and talk with you for the next many, many hours, but I'm also really, really excited to hear from the held plaintiffs. And I think a lot of synergy actually in this courageous work of what we need to do in order to live on a life-giving planet. So as we wrap up our conversation here, I'd just love to hear one thing that you're each excited about and looking forward to, and also one thing that folks who are here with us in the audience can do to support and participate in regeneration and healing on land.
Okay, so wait, one more time. Something excited about, okay.
One thing folks in the audience can
do. Okay, audience, what you can do, one thing I'm excited about. I was worried about the microphone. Where's the microphone? I am ridiculously excited. My father and I got to write a children's book together, which is going to be born into the world in 2025. And it's called Every Peach is a Story. And you definitely need a box of Kleenex to get through the story. The plot is a multi-generational Japanese-American farm and a young girl learning about how to tell when a peach is ripe through the senses from her father and her grandfather. But there's so much more in the book. And so I am so excited. I still think of myself as a new mom. I have almost a 2-year-old, so just this just tears streaming down the face of like, I cannot wait for this book to be out. And then, so for you all today gathered, thank you for being here, for your presence. I am struck by the beautiful contrast of the question, what is the smallest thing you can do to contribute to a relational way of life with land, with people, plants, creatures that are non-human, and what is the most audacious dream you have for the next generation?
So what gets me excited is the work that's going to continue, because I'm always excited about the next generations. Because when I work with interns, I'm always giving them assignments and projects, and I always see that they're so innovative in the work that they do, and they're so creative in the work that they do. Even watching my kids, you know, asking them brainstorming questions and just watching them work. So I'm most excited for the youth, because as long as we invest in our youth, then we know that we're sustaining ourselves as people. So I ask you all to make sure that you invest in our youth, the youth who are going into natural resources, the youth who are going into every avenue, because it's our youth who's going to help sustain our planet, and it's our youth that are seeing us need to make these changes in the world. So just focus on our youth, because they're the ones who are always going to come after to take care of Mother Earth. So thank you.
Amazing.
Would you like to get some questions from the audience?
Oh, it's up to you. I don't know how we are doing on time. Yeah.
So I don't want to take up entire space.
That's okay. There's probably some questions. Any questions? Again, I'm visually impaired here, so. Oh, we have one over there, okay.
Can you describe one of the heritage Japanese regenerative farming methods?
Sure. I mean, there's so the one that's coming to me is the idea of planting things that you want to be there for multiple generations. And I'm clearly like a humanist. I come at this through humanities. So the other thing that I'm thinking about is my great-grandmother, Tsuwa Masumoto, who lived in the house my wife and I get to live in. She would take farm walks every day. And the idea that farm walks, like visiting the berries every week, that is scientific observation, but it's also spiritual and emotional. So I think about the practices that on the surface seem very simple, but are really dense with how we relate to a place we call home. That's what I think about as regenerative methods.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I'd really like to say thanks for the discussion about the power of story. I've been working as a science communicator for over a decade, and I've gotten a really burning passion for regenerative ag in the last several years. And I work at an organic farm in Moise part-time. And right all around there, there's a lot of monocrop wheat. And at the end of the season, after harvest, there's kind of a tradition where they just burn the plant residue off. There's these huge black plumes of smoke, and the farmer I work for always jokes about all that free carbon that they're just burning into the atmosphere rather than sequestering in the soil. But it's a multi-generational story that's being told there as well, with families that have made money doing this, and it just kind of follows generation after generation. So my question is, how do we use story to respectfully but meaningfully kind of change the discussion around commercial agriculture in a positive direction?
Thank you for that question. I find that a lot of people have stories around being a good neighbor, and that is a story that can be a bridge between very different ways of life and very different ways of engaging with current political and cultural moments. For me, that's been a story I'm really interested. That's a question I'm always really interested in asking people, and a question I'm interested in drawing people out on. As maybe a number of folks know, my first project that I worked on was with a really diverse group of farmers in central and eastern Montana, many of whom had been on their land for a couple, 3 or 4 generations, and were converting family conventional farms to organic and to more diversified rotations. And it was really striking how that idea about being a good neighbor and how you only thrive in community formed a kind of thread that brought together a group of people that otherwise had a lot of differences, like folks who were hippies from Missoula and went back to the land for that reason, and folks for whom this actually was not a comfortable space, but who had this thread of being a good neighbor and understanding that at some point you're going to need something from a neighbor when you're in a time of need, and that's also true of plants and of land, and that you can think about your land management practices in that same way. So that just for me in my individual journey has been a way that a kind of story that I see many people carrying can build a bridge.
I'll just say one quick thing. I think that the story is a powerful tool, and to be responsible storytellers, what are the stories that we're repeating? We need to interrogate where their stories came from. So the stories is not just fluff. They're powerful. So I would for me, your question raises we need to interrogate those stories about burning. Where did that come from? I don't have no idea, but where? How did that start? And then what do different people hear when they hear that story?
Okay, we are at our break point. Thank you very much, guys. That's wonderful. Okay. We're now going to hear from one of the youths and their attorney, who led the historical climate change lawsuit this past year, Held versus Montana, where these I was going to explain who they are, but I guess I don't need to. So with no further ado, attorney Roger Sullivan and plaintiff Lander Busey, whose, by the way, whose father is running for governor. Vote for him.
Thank you, Jerry.
Okay.
Thank you. When I was first contacted about speaking at this event, I have to confess I was wondering how our trial fit into a literary festival. But when I heard the theme of this gathering, finding our place in nature, the power of story, it began to make sense to me. First, the choice of the inclusive pronoun our resonated, especially capitalized as it was in the literature I got. And one of the tragic maladies of these times, as we're all painfully aware, is the dissolution of our native sense of belonging together as part of the glorious family of things that we've heard about through such lyrical presentations one after the other today. Second, there was indeed a powerful story well told by a chorus of voices of young Montanans and renowned scientists woven together for the world to hear, both about the awesome beauty of this place that we call home and the devastation that is befalling it because of the climate crisis that we are all painfully aware of and personally experiencing. So today we'd like to share with you some of the trial which bore witness to our story, which really includes all of us. Powerful stories have a way of carrying us into a dimension of depth and a realm of mystery. Norman Maclean instructed that our rivers run over rocks from the basement of time, and under the rocks are the words. I know of no more powerful acknowledgement of this land of Montana, calling forth the words than the preamble to the Montana Constitution. And so that's where our trial began. We called as our first witness Maynann Ellingson. If I could have the next slide there, Tom. Yeah, Tom, even the next slide. Maynann Ellingson, the youngest delegate to the Montana 1972 Constitutional Convention, who was an author and a champion of the preamble to the Montana Constitution, which is really a prayer of gratitude to this place that we call Montana. Tom.
There we go.
Okay.
There she is.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, going back to what you were saying, Roger, and how special it is that we all get to be here and be rooted in this theme of storytelling, and how special it is that someone like Maynann Ellingson really led and began writing this story in her youth of how she saw and how Montanans at the time unilaterally saw the importance of the place that they lived in and the resources that were at their disposal and how they needed to protect those things. So even in her youth, she had the foresight, along with the other delegates, to understand that this was a story that was 100 years in the making, that just happened to originate with our 1972 Constitution. So as we look back into this last year, going through almost 4 years of very, very intense litigation, that story has another chapter that she had the foresight to see, and that we now have the responsibility as the youth of Montana to uphold the words that she wrote in that Constitution. So we are eternally grateful for Maynann Ellingson and her foresight to look down the line, and for her contributions to this case. She was with us every step of the way in the courtroom, when she testified, and has continued to come out and support the plaintiffs and see us whenever she can. And that just goes to show the power that these actions had even so long ago, that keep resonating with us through this case now. So thank you, Maynann. We couldn't be more grateful for your support.
I think it was kind of revelatory and encouraging that as a young student here in Missoula in the late 60s, early 70s, Maynann, along with some other Missoula women, maybe some of you are out there today, were part of a group called GASP, Gals Against Smog and Pollution. For those of you that were in the Missoula Valley in those days, you knew about the terrible air pollution from the Warner Waldorf paper mill. And so that was a motivating force of not only Maynann, but other of the young delegates to the Constitutional Convention, so that beyond this beautiful prayer, Tom, if you could give me the next slide, which I never get tired of reciting, we, the people of Montana, grateful to God for the quiet beauty of our state, the grandeur of our mountains, the vastness of our rolling plains, and desiring to improve the quality of life, equality of opportunity, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this and future generations, do ordain and establish this Constitution. This theme of intergenerational responsibility was, kind of inserted throughout the Constitution. If we could have the next slide, please. So the other important provisions occur in terms of this right to a clean and healthful environment is embedded in Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution. It's a right of, it's an inalienable right, the first of our inalienable rights, to a clean and healthful environment. And it's it's companioned with a corresponding responsibility that's found in Article 9, Section 1 of the Constitution, which provides that the state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment in Montana for present and future generations. So it was this set of rights and responsibilities upon which we have begun to develop this, this legacy of responsibility to future generations that Held v. Montana is a really vitally important part of. But notwithstanding these important constitutional provisions that really, they really haven't been fulfilled on the ground. And maybe you could address the experiences, Landry, that you and other of the youth plaintiffs have had in terms of, in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, obviously this case is unique for many reasons, including, as Roger mentioned, our wonderful Constitution, but also because the uniqueness of all the plaintiffs involved in this case. You see some of the pictures here, some of the experiences I've been lucky enough to have in my youth, a lot of the lessons that I've learned from my father and from my mother, and how we, and my brother as well, have learned those things, that we must carry a sense of respect and gratitude every time we step foot into these places, regardless of what it is we're doing. And so from a very young age, I was taught to respect the land, and every harvest, every excursion was more important than the last, and to find something to learn. You're never too young to learn something from this land. So carrying that everywhere, but also the, like I said, the uniqueness of the other plaintiffs. Badge and I are unique to this case because of our gratitude to the land and how it's provided us with food and security and the best place to live ever. But the other plaintiffs in this case as well, whether it's Sariel Sandoval of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes and their spiritual connection to the land, or Ricky Held, there are a lot of, we'll do it all, but there are a plethora of reasons why all these unique plaintiffs decided to join on, and all for very specific and spiritual reasons. Ricky and a ranch in eastern Montana have seen significant degradation as a result of the failing climate that was the reason why her name went on this case. She's an incredible human being who cares so much, just like all the rest of us do, about the place that we are grateful enough to live in. So there is definitely a huge connection spiritually, obviously, with how she is involved in this case, but also economically, also in terms of her familial values and connection with this place. It's a lot more than just I enjoy it. There are very, very serious reasons why we all decided to become a part of this case, especially with Sariel, as I mentioned as well. Her family and the culture of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have forever been using this land and respecting this land as we've been taught now, but for many generations longer, they have been the keepers of this land. So obviously, her connection with this and how her family and her heritage is connected with this case is very, very unique and very special, that she can bring that representation to this case too. So yeah, incredibly special.
Each of the 16 youth plaintiffs had really powerful stories to tell and had the opportunity to do so at the trial. But one of the things that became apparent to me throughout was just how much you were loved. You came from support, whether it was some of the indigenous communities that some of our youth plaintiffs came from, the families of origin, a lot of really wonderful parenting, community support, and love. But in order to bring a case like this based on the Constitution, it's not a simple matter of just kind of marching into court. You really have to invoke the judicial power. Given our separation, our doctrine of separation of powers, we really had to, make sure that we designed the case so that we were challenging actions by the legislature that had been enacted and signed into law by the governor. And in Montana, there were several statutory frameworks that really encouraged the development of fossil fuels that were directly resulting in a significant contribution to climate change, affecting the environmental qualities that Lander and others were experiencing. And those included both Montana's state energy policy. We had a state energy policy act that actually encouraged the extraction, transportation, and combustion of fossil fuels. And that was tethered to a provision in Montana's Environmental Policy Act that actually was at least interpreted by our state agencies to prohibit the consideration of the impacts to climate change from these fossil fuel related activities, whether it was permitting a coal mine, an expansion of a coal mine, oil and gas drilling. These impacts to the atmosphere, greenhouse gas, climate change were actually prohibited from being considered. So that was really, it seemed to us, a pretty logical way to proceed in terms of bringing this into the courts. But that didn't prevent the state from filing just one motion after another. They included numerous motions to dismiss as well as motions for summary judgment, all of which we prevailed on for the most part. And so as we were approaching trial, finally, thank you, Tom, literally the state moved its defense of this lawsuit from the courtroom really to the back rooms of the legislature, because in the waning days of the 2023 legislative session, we were faced with a whole series of laws that were enacted with the intent of derailing our lawsuit just weeks before our long-awaited trial date. They included House Bill 170, which actually was intended to amend the statute that we were challenging in MIPA, but it actually just clarified what we were arguing anyway. So notwithstanding that the state of Montana took it up to the Supreme Court trying to prevent us to get our day in court, the Supreme Court said, well, actually, it seems to us the legislature just clarified the existing statute. It does not want any of our agencies to consider greenhouse gases or climate change when deciding whether or not to permit fossil fuel-related activities. And likewise, they did repeal the Energy Policy Act, which we were trying to get the court to declare it basically void by virtue of violating these constitutional provisions. So in that sense, I suppose they did us a favor. They repealed the entire bill. And then finally, in literally, I think about 9 days before trial, or it looks like about 20 days before trial, they passed Senate Bill 557, which really took away, purportedly took away, the remedial powers of our judicial system to invoke remedies that would have prevented the harms that we were suing on. So that was their attempt. They even brought this back up twice to the Supreme Court, trying to keep us out of our day in court. But we got there, and at long last, notwithstanding all of these last-minute laws, we got our day in court, and I think I'll turn it back over to Lander to talk about his experiences.
Well, as Roger mentioned, this was an incredibly long time coming, aside from the last few months leading up to that were even more hard-fought, I think. That was some of the most energy exerted came from our wonderful attorneys in the months leading up when the state was trying to pull every single rug out from underneath us they possibly could. Thankfully, the judiciary saw through that and made sure that we had our day. So finally, when we got there, I'm assuming and hoping some of you might have even gotten to see it or been in the courtroom, but it was quite the experience to see what kind of excuses the state could put on display for us. But I think it was two of their expert witnesses that just like no-showed pretty much. Yeah, so paid consultants with your taxpayer dollars who were brought in to bring expert testimony to the state's defense after a week long of our litigation and all of us testifying, which I'll go into a little bit, and all of our wonderful experts who all testified free of charge for us and brought their services and their expertise to benefit the youth of Montana and to uphold the state's constitution and with our argument in court. So leading up to that, Dr. Judith Curry, who was paid too much to be a part of their litigation, didn't even show up, and in fact 2 days before she was supposed to take the stand decided that she would not be participating. But during the litigation, we had incredible testimony from these experts and also the very, very heartfelt stories of the plaintiffs. It was a very emotional time to be up there, and especially when the state was still so vigorously hell-bent on making sure, given that they didn't even plan, really, it seemed, on us getting to court in the first place, their lackluster and blatant outbursts like in the courtroom that showed that there was something very clearly wrong with how they thought this was going to go, especially when it came to expert testimony and knowing that, for lack of a better term, we really had our shit together and we had the people for the job. So some of the folks, the wonderful experts who we had testify, Dr. Steve Running, I'll talk about this a little bit. Dr. Steve Running, who worked at the Flathead Lake Wildlife Institute, not institute, I'm botching the words on this here, but he's a Nobel laureate, brought some incredible information to the, we can't go to the next one now, sorry. Yeah, thank you, sorry about that. But here we can see some of the information that Steve helped brought to the case, which is the parts per million of carbon in our atmosphere over time. And at the time when we testified on this case, it was stated that a livable climate or sustainable climate would have 350 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere to be sustainable. We are now at 420 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere, and it's a hard statistic to take in, but luckily we're not here to talk about how this case is going down the gutter. We're here to talk about the progress and the victories of what this case upholds. So Steve brought some incredible information and expertise to the case, along with Dr. Kathy Whitlock.
Yeah, we can have the next slide, Tom.
Yeah. Next one. But I will go back to this really quick, because I really can't stress enough how important it is that these experts were not just concerned citizens. They are people with decades-long careers with very specific expertise in their field who thought it to be their responsibility as much as it was ours to bring their talents to this case. It was the completely opposite. It's the completely opposite end of the spectrum for the state's case, which not only was, to put it kindly, incomplete, but without any sort of direction or capable understanding of the science of these cases. And as it was revealed in the courtroom, they had very little understanding of even basic science regarding these things. So It was definitely good to see the experts give them a good lesson in the courtroom, though. So, yeah, very refreshing. But yeah, Dr. Kathy Whitlock, professor from Montana State, lead author from the 2017 Montana Climate Assessment. She had some incredible work done brought into the courtroom about just the overall analysis of how Montana's climate has been shifting over time, and how, more importantly, the contributions by the state towards the degradation, and given our constitutional provisions, how those are directly intertwined with the harms that we, the plaintiffs, are experiencing, and also the degradation of the environment that we live in as well. So some of her work on this assessment was crucial in analyzing the particular elements of how the state contributed to that degradation. Yeah. And then of Lori Byron, incredible person who did some great work really laying out to the state just how elaborate the harms we as plaintiffs are experiencing as a result of this inaction or action, however you want to put it, by the state. All of us, like I said, have very personal stories and very personal experiences and very personal harms that are correlated directly with this case. I, for example, have incredibly bad seasonal allergies. I'm sure many of you do as well. And to some, that might just be like a throwaway thing of something that you just deal with or whatnot. But the thing is that the changing climate, along with much of these other issues of the air quality and the contribution to whether it's lack of forest management or lack of attention to the fossil fuel extraction, all of those directly correlate with the asthma that we're experiencing on a daily basis, the allergies that we're having, being able to recreate in this place that our Constitution guarantees shall be clean and maintained for future generations, and not just stayed the same, but it shall be maintained and improved. That's a very important piece to take away from this, is that these harms that we're experiencing are ongoing and worsening as a case because of the state's actions, as opposed to the Constitution that says that our environment shall be maintained and improved. So there's a complete lack of, I guess, just reading the Constitution, apparently, and analyzing how we need to be approaching this, because as our harms get worse and our environment continues to degrade, we have to uphold our responsibility to make sure that our state is going in the direction that our constitutional framers intended it to. So yeah, I think a lot of these harms are very, very specific, but they will continue to worsen, and along with the environmental degradation, if we do not continue to fight on these issues and on these grounds. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was really the scientific evidence, both in terms of the ecologists and the medical doctors, really went to this issue of what we framed as intergenerational justice. Remember the provision in the Constitution that the state and each person shall maintain and improve the environment, right, for this and future generations. So that was just baked in, that awareness, that consciousness was baked into, that responsibility was baked into the Constitution, and really a broken responsibility. Next, I'll talk just a moment about the testimony that was given by Michael Durglow Jr., who's continues to be head of the Tribal Preservation Department of the Confederated and Salish and Kootenai tribes, and also chairman of their tribe's Climate Change Advisory Committee. And he reiterated the testimony from our Indigenous youth plaintiffs, and just, kind of fleshed it out in terms of how climate change is really disrupting the cultural practices and traditions and even access to traditional food sources for our tribes, our indigenous people, and specifically to our youth plaintiffs. And he really framed it in terms of, we heard from this morning from Rosalyn on the this concept of TEK, and he kind of brought that into the courtroom and as an expert witness, and really helped describe to us, if I could have the next slide, please, this concept of kind of a integrated life ways. You'll see in this illustration that the Confederated and Salish Kootenai tribes use. They really see, as some of our speakers were describing, the two-legged ones as in community with all of the other aspects of our environment. The four-legged ones, the plants, even the artifacts such as there, you'll see the formerly named Kerr Dam there as part of their community of concern. And they saw themselves and their tribe as part of this system, and therefore responsible for maintaining it in a resilient fashion. And I thought that it really added a powerful dimension to the trial. If I could have the next slide, please. An important component at trial was to really be able to demonstrate then, over the course of the last number of decades, what has been on the ground, both the policy of the state of Montana in terms of fossil fuel extraction and combustion, how has that been ongoing? And there was no one better to lay that out, that historical part of the story out, than Ann Hedges, the executive director of the Montana Environmental Information Center. And Ann and that organization over the course really of the last 50 years has been more or less the watchdog. The mission statement of that organization is clean and healthful, you are right, our mission. And indeed, they have been, in terms of protecting the public interest, they have attempted to comment on virtually every major proposal for fossil fuel use, extraction, permitting. And in the result, though, I've kind of highlighted there, I think, one of the facts that caught the attention of everyone, even at a late hour of the afternoon like this. It seemed like she was on the stand, but the judge's head and everyone else's head went up when, as a matter of fact, it was pointed out that defendants have never denied a permit or license for fossil fuel activities in the state of Montana. And so that was more or less an important nail in our project here, because we were trying to show the state of Montana adhering, in terms of on the ground, their stated policy of encouraging fossil fuel extraction while putting on the blinders, making it a law to even consider the impacts of greenhouse gases. And so this should probably come as no result. If I could have the next slide, thank you. And so we also had Mr. Peter Eriksson from the Stockholm Institute, who is a specialist in this emerging field of greenhouse gas accounting. And he testified that it's both possible to calculate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that result from Montana's fossil fuel extraction, transport, and consumption activities, and that are authorized by the defendant. And they are, not surprisingly, enormous, equivalent to, as indicated on that demonstrative exhibit that we used, to countries such as Argentina, the Netherlands, or Pakistan, with a population of over 200 million. And the other important factor is that it actually could get worse, because Montana has the largest recoverable coal reserves in the United States. We have something on the order of 30% of all of the recoverable coal here. So indeed, what happens here going forward will have a profound effect, both in the state, in the region, the nation, and the world. But it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to continue on that same course, and for that reason, maybe we could have Lander describe the testimony of Mark Jacobson.
Yeah, so again, it can be really hard to look at these statistics and to hear this information and find hope in the actions that we're taking. But after a long day of litigation and a lot of emotion and a lot of sadness, hearing from these experts, Mark Jacobson was there to remind us that there is light at the end of this tunnel. And Montana is very, very unique in that although we have not exactly taken advantage of these resources, we have incredible, incredible potential for renewable and clean energy alternatives that he was there to point out for us, as looked at in that graphic back there. Yeah, I was like, yeah, we're good. But yeah, and so we were able to get on the stand that the potential for particularly wind energy across Montana's Great Plains and everywhere else is very, very exploitable and very, very useful in a clean energy transition. So exactly as Roger said, that it doesn't have to be this way, and moreover, our economy doesn't need to function this way. To be able to sustainably and effectively transition to not only have clean and renewable energy, but a renewable economy as well, is very, very much still in the cards for Montana. And so with the testimony of Dr. Jacobson, we were able to have some incredible insight about just what kind of alternatives and what kind of steps we could be taking as a state to pursue these clean energy alternatives. So, yeah.
In one of the other aspects to his testimony, that it would not only be enormously positive to the Montana environment, but also economically, really important to Montana consumers,
Yeah.
because they would save annually, literally billions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole fossil fuel-based economy that we, in essence, are more or less forced to consume could be quite different, and so that was a really important part of his testimony. We concluded the trial after 7 days, and then we awoke the trial judge's decision, which was then issued on August 14th of 2023. And by the way, I'm making available through Jenny this outline in case there's any of you that want to dig a little deeper into this. A lot of these slides are hyperlinked, so that if you're at all interested in some of the documents, you could go to that go on to the website, hyperlink to these documents. It's on my website, so you're welcome to do that if you're interested in this in any greater detail. But the order was really a resounding victory for us. The court's determination was, really reflected the scientific evidence that was adduced at trial. The court found that Montana's current annual emissions are locally, nationally, and globally significant, and that significantly, the more carbon you're pumping into the atmosphere, the more you're going to impact the climate and increase the exposure of our youth plaintiffs to harm, and not only them, future generations, because remember, we're talking about this concept of intergenerational justice. And so the order, the findings of fact, and the conclusions of law were largely reflected the testimony at trial, and the challenged statutes were declared unconstitutional, and the state of Montana has been enjoined from acting in accordance with those unconstitutionally enacted laws. We then will talk about the next steps here, and so the appeal was filed by the state of Montana in September, and I argued the appeal before the Montana Supreme Court on July 10th. It was quite an event. It was really well attended. We had good coverage of it. That's another element that's been an important part of the case. We've had, kind of not only national but international interest in it because it is really a pioneering effort on this, this concept of intergenerational justice. And so we're now waiting for the Montana Supreme Court's decision. It typically takes anywhere from 2 to 6 months for a decision to be issued. So we expect a decision by the end of the year. And then the task will turn to the enforcement of the decision. How is it that each of us can help in terms of holding the state of Montana and its agencies to the responsibility, recall the responsibility, the state and each person shall maintain a clean and healthful environment for this and future generations. And I would submit that our youth plaintiffs have done their part, and we could use all the help we can get in getting the state to uphold its responsibilities.
Thank you. I think quickly I will mention though that we talk about this as doing our part, and so many people come up to us and our attorneys and shake our hands and thank us for all the work that we've been able to do and put into this. And the best way I can put this is that the framers of the Constitution, as I mentioned this story starting very, very early on with Maynard Ellingson's insight and that of the Montana Constitution, we knew that we had to be a part of this, not just because, as the state so lovingly put in the press, to get documentary deals and to get our names out there on the map and to really try to just become microclimate celebrities, I guess, we in fact did this because it was our responsibility to the state. Our instructions were laid out very plain in 1972 of what we needed to do in the coming years, and with the brilliant insight of our attorneys and the expertise of our experts, we were able to uphold and continue the fight that was laid out for us so long ago in 1972. So yeah, thank you all so much for being here. I think we're going to open it up to a Q&A here a little bit. We got some time left. So yeah, thank you guys again so much, and I hope you're able to learn more about the case.
So there have been some other cases that have been in the news recently, most notably the one in Hawaii. How much exchange, interchange has been there? Have you had any between other groups that are pursuing something similar in other states?
Yeah, we have. The connecting thread here is a fabulous organization called Our Children's Trust out of Eugene, Oregon, which was integral to this case and the Hawaii case. Interestingly, as you may be aware, the Hawaii Constitution has a similar provision, not identical, but similar provision. And so it really, this case was able to be leveraged in terms of challenging the Hawaii Transportation Plan. It was a smaller scale case. It challenged their transportation plan, which was too fossil fuel reliant. And fortunately, the governor, shortly before trial, agreed to a settlement that is really putting Hawaii on a path that Montana could likewise follow.
One more here?
Yes, I got one here.
Okay.
As you just recently stated that our Children's Trust in Eugene follows the question of the gentleman previously. Is your case helping them because they've been at it for 12 or 14 years or something with theirs against Juliana versus the U.S. government? Is your case now, the result of your case, helping them, or did they help you? Thanks.
The distinction between Juliana versus U.S. in the federal court of Oregon is that it was predicated on the United States Constitution. And although the federal court ruled in favor of the Juliana plaintiffs that they had established various violations of substantive due process, procedural due process, and equal protection, the Ninth Circuit reversed in a 2-to-1 decision. So our case is based, as we explained, on the Montana Constitution. The Montana Constitution provides us with adequate and independent grounds so that we don't anticipate a cert to the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's why this case is serving as a precedent for other states that have similar provisions in their state constitutions.
Thank you both for your detailed summary, let alone the roles that you have occupied in this historic case. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more, though. Presumably, the Supreme Court will rule against the appeal. How will the enforcement provisions roll out when the shit hits the fan? Will the DEQ, for example, or the DNRC and their policies on the ground in particular instances?
That's where you come in. It actually will, assuming that there's affirmance, and that's not guaranteed, but we're hopeful people, and we're assuming that it will be affirmed because it was a really solid decision based on the facts. But if that's the case, then yeah, unfortunately, here in Montana, the reality is that we actually heard Bill McKibben talk a little bit about that this morning, about the framework within which we're operating. The dominant paradigm is one where there are powerful forces who are profiting from fossil fuel extraction and combustion, and they're not going to stop that without continued fights. And part of that is they have moneyed interests that are also reflected in our politics, in our campaigns. And so, yeah, we have this historic decision by a courageous trial court judge. We expect it will be affirmed, but no guarantees. We do expect that. And then it's going to have to be enforced. And that's going to take the grit and the participation in Public Service Commission proceedings and DEQ proceedings for fossil fuel permits by all of us on an ongoing business, because once again, the cost of this kind of freedom is indeed eternal vigilance.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And don't forget to vote for Lander's dad, and he won't be signing bills like Gianforte did up there. Okay. Who speaks for the trees? Our next guest does. Mari Margol is an author and executive director of the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, where she leads an effort to establish the international legal rights of nature. She's a graduate of Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Mary will address the emerging legal strategy called the legal rights of nature that provides ecosystems and species to have the same legal protections as people and corporations. So I want to hear this. Mary Margol.
All right. He just told me to give him hell. I'm going to do what I can here, everybody. Thank you so much. It's really so nice to be here. This has been a really interesting day, and one of the earlier speakers said they were curious why they were invited to a literary festival. Me too. But here we are. And so, a literary festival on the environment, and I have to say I've really enjoyed it. And so I thought what I would do was tell you a story, perhaps a scary story, but one that I think has deep parallels with other stories. And like those other stories, will hopefully leave you, me, us, less scared, more hopeful and inspired. So let's start with the scary part first. You've heard a lot today. The last panel, I think, very much reflects on what I'm going to speak about today, and they tell a scary story about what's going on not only in Montana but around the world. And the reality is that human activity today is destroying the natural systems upon which all life depends, such that we must now make systemic change in how we live on the earth if we and the plants and the animals and the other creatures that we share the planet with, if we're going to survive. If we look at environmental laws today in the United States, such as the Federal Clean Air Act, the Federal Clean Water Act, and similar laws around the world, we find that these laws treat nature, the natural world, as a thing, as an item of commerce or of property, as a resource, without inherent rights or protections. These environmental laws regulate the use or exploitation of that thing, that is, of nature. Thus, rather than protect nature, environmental laws largely regulate its use. We heard in the previous panel so much about this. So if you're from Montana, talking about fossil fuels, fracking, if you're from this area, you're probably very likely familiar with fracking. It's the main way we extract oil and gas today. It involves drilling miles underground, through rock, through aquifers, and then causing explosions underground to release the oil and gas. And the impacts are great. This fracking causes earthquakes. Further, at every frack well, of which there's over 1 million across the United States, at each well, millions of gallons of fresh water are used and contaminated. And studies have found that massive amounts of methane, a major climate change polluter, are leaking from frack wells. Not to mention the combustion of the oil and gas that gets extracted from each frack well. Knowing all of this, it may be surprising to learn that it's environmental laws, rather than protecting us against something that brings known environmental harm, such as fracking, that these laws instead legalize fracking. And fracking, of course, is not unique. We've heard today about industrial factory farming, which warehouses thousands of animals at each factory farm. It uses massive amounts of antibiotics, leading to antibiotic resistance in humans. Factory farming, of course, also causes significant air and water pollution, to say nothing of the conditions for the animals themselves. Rather than protect against factory farming, environmental laws legalize them. And the list goes on and on. Rather than protect against the dumping of toxic sewage sludge on farmland, environmental laws legalize it. You may have been hearing recently in the news about forever chemicals, which cause cancer, birth complications, liver damage, and on and on. These are widely found in sewage sludge, sludge which has long been promoted by both the government and the waste industry as a fertilizer, which covers our farm fields across the country. Environmental laws legalize the dumping of sewage sludge on the farmland where our food is grown. And if we need any better example of what environmental laws do, the previous panel told us with the Montana Environmental Policy Act and other laws which have never, they told us, have never denied a permit for a license for fossil fuel activity in the state of Montana. That's what our environmental laws do. They're about permitting and licensing activities which extract and use and exploit the natural world, rather than protecting against those things. And the list, of course, goes on and on and on about the different kinds of industrial activities which are legally allowing the exploitation and destruction of the natural world. So in short, environmental laws legalize environmental harm, and so that despite the thousands of environmental laws we have in place around the world, nature is in big trouble. And it's no wonder, of course, right? Because environmental laws are largely written by the very industries they're intended to regulate, and they are in the business of legalizing environmental harm. And the consequences, of course, are growing more clear every single day. Ecosystems such as coral reefs, over the past few years, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia and reefs around the world have faced mass bleaching and die-off events due to rising ocean temperatures, pollution, and other human-caused threats. Coral reefs provide habitat and food for thousands of marine species, which leads us to species extinction. Extinction is occurring today far, far faster than natural background rates. We are now, good job us, rivaling the time of the dinosaurs in our ability to wipe out species, such that we're now in an era many are calling the Anthropocene, in which we, humans, are causing the 6th great extinction event on Earth. This time, of course, due to human activity. The 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services found, quote, 1 million species already face extinction, many within decades. And of course, if you've turned on the TV in the last week and seen news of Hurricane Helene, finally, mainstream news is finally talking about extreme storms like hurricanes of having something to do with climate change. Climate change. Human activity is perhaps forever changing the chemistry of our atmosphere, pumping carbon pollution into the air, causing more and more of the sun's heat to be captured and raising temperatures, and I would say not only potentially, but truly catastrophic ways. We now know that the past 10 years have been the hottest on human record. And 4 days this July were the hottest ever recorded. So we have extreme storms, melting of glaciers, rising sea levels, acidification of the ocean, forest fires, smoke, species extinction, as well as species migration to cooler, higher elevations and latitudes, and of course, similar human migration. And these are impacts that we're really only beginning to get our minds around, even though we've been warned about them for decades. And so the question is, how did we get here? So that was supposed to be part of the scary part of the story. But it still gets scarier before we get to the less scary. There's a lot of factors that we can look at, of course, about how did we get here. And one of the key factors is the long history of how colonial and other powers treated people and nature, and the legal and cultural norms that were used to legitimize their exploitation. So during the time of slavery, enslaved people were considered to be property, things, without legal rights. They were the ultimate human resource, free labor to build the wealth of slaveholders and governments. And to legalize and legitimize this practice, those in power used law and established cultural norms that normalized the enslavement of other humans. Slave codes were put in place, not unlike environmental laws today, which established how slaveholders could use, sell, and even destroy their property. If we consider the infamous U.S. Supreme Court case, Dred Scott, in 1857, Dred Scott sought freedom from slavery for himself and for his family. The Supreme Court denied that a black person could be a citizen, ruling that they were, in the words of the court, a subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race. This was both a legal judgment and a cultural one. The court was unable or unwilling to imagine enslaved people any other way. Women. Women were similarly treated as property. Again, the law and the culture were used to both legitimize and legalize the control and oppression of women. Under coverture laws, a woman's legal identity and rights were considered covered by her husbands, and her own legal identity was considered non-existent. As property, women were considered to be owned by their husband or their father. This meant, for example, that rape of a woman was considered to be a property crime, with monetary damages to be paid to the father or husband. If we consider the 1875 decision in Wisconsin where lawyer Lavinia Goodell sought to practice before the state Supreme Court, the Wisconsin Supreme Court thought otherwise. This is what they wrote. The law of nature destines and qualifies the female sex for the bearing and nurture of children and for the custody of the homes of the world. The court went on to say, all lifelong callings of women, inconsistent with these sacred duties of their sex, are departures from the order of nature, and when voluntary, treason against it. The law, the culture, together so successfully normalized the subordination of women, the court's justices couldn't or wouldn't suggest anything different. Together, law and culture have long been wielded by those in power to stay in power, and those that they oppress to keep them oppressed. The law and societal norms effectively shaping who is protected and why. Nature finds itself in a similar situation today. Nature is legally treated as property, something to be owned, sold, used, destroyed, without recognized legal rights. Culture has also been used, including language, to reinforce this, with environmental laws aimed at, quote unquote, managing forests or controlling species. And nature itself is not considered a living entity so much as a natural resource that exists for us to exploit. Under this legal and cultural framework today in the United States, we can't defend even the most basic right of nature to exist because there are no legal rights to defend. But this is beginning to change. With every headline about extreme weather, about hurricanes, about forest fires, global heating, extinction, drought, the status quo is being questioned as more people ask what might seem like a pretty basic question at this point. Why aren't our environmental laws protecting the environment? And the answer is that we can't protect the environment under a legal system that treats nature as property, much like we couldn't protect enslaved people under a legal system that treated them as property. We can't protect the environment under a legal system that protects commerce and development over people and nature. And at its most basic, we can't protect the environment under a structure of law and of governance that wasn't written to protect it in the first place. In the face of all of this, today, a new people's movement for nature is building. Like past movements to end slavery, to recognize rights of women, rights of indigenous peoples, and others, this movement is focused on transformation. Transforming nature, which is treated today as a thing existing for human use, to being recognized as a living entity with legal rights. And like past movements, this new movement for the rights of nature is focused on transforming the very purpose of law and government itself, from a system dependent on and designed to exploit nature to one designed to protect and defend its rights. So the very first law in the world to recognize that nature possesses legal rights was drafted by the co-founder of my organization, the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights, by Thomas Lindsay, and this was in 2006. The law was developed for the community of Tamaqua Borough in Pennsylvania that was facing the prospect of hazardous dredge material and other toxic materials being used to fill massive pits left from decades of coal mining. Finding that they were unable to stop this under existing environmental laws, that those laws actually authorize the dumping of toxins in their community, Tamaqua determined that they had to protect the environment and they had to do something different. It became the first place anywhere in the world to enact a law that recognized nature has rights of its own, and that dumping of toxic dredge and other waste would violate those rights. Other Pennsylvania communities soon followed, and today communities in New Hampshire, New York, Virginia, and in other states have the rights of nature in law. 2 years later, in 2008, we were invited to Ecuador, where the country was engaged in the drafting of a new constitution, facing multinational corporations coming in to mine and extract, and a country that, as you may know, is renowned for its unique ecosystems, its biodiversity hotspots from the Amazon to the Andes to the Galapagos. The threats there to the natural environment were growing. We consulted with their elected delegates to their constituent assembly to draft rights of nature constitutional provisions. And then the people of Ecuador, through a national referendum vote, became the first in the world to enshrine the rights of nature in a national constitution. Ecuador's constitution recognizes that nature possesses fundamental rights, and nature, or Pachamama, includes rights to exist, to regenerate, to evolve, and be restored. And today, the rights of nature movement is growing. There are national rights of nature laws in place not only in Ecuador, but as well in Bolivia, and Panama, Spain, Uganda. Courts in Colombia, India, and Bangladesh have recognized the rights of rivers and other ecosystems. Local and state laws and policies have been adopted in Brazil, in Mexico, Canada, Australia, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and England. National rights of nature legislation has been introduced into the legislatures of the Philippines and Switzerland and Sweden. As well, First Nations and tribal nations have adopted rights of nature laws and policies. This includes the Menominee Tribe of Wisconsin, recognizing the rights of the Menominee River, the Yurok Tribe in Northern California, recognizing the rights of the Klamath River, the Nez Perce, recognizing rights of the Snake River, and the White Earth Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota, recognizing the rights of Menomin, or wild rice. These laws and policies and court rulings, they represent a significant and we believe necessary shift in how the law treats nature and how we govern ourselves toward the natural world. So rather than treating nature as existing for human use, with environmental laws regulating and authorizing that use, rights of nature laws recognize that nature is a living entity with legal rights, including rights to exist, to thrive, to regenerate, to evolve, as well as the right to perform its natural functions, the right to a healthy environment, the right to be restored if harmed and its rights are violated. And these rights have now been brought into court to be defended and enforced. So in Ecuador, where the rights of nature constitutional provisions have been in place now for over 15 years, a number of cases have been decided, including at their highest court, their constitutional court. And this includes the 2021 Los Cedros case. The Los Cedros forest in northwest Ecuador includes humid forests and a cloud forest. In 2017, Ecuador's national environmental agencies authorized 2 corporations to conduct exploratory mining in Los Cedros, an area that was designated as a protected forest some years before. In this landmark case, Ecuador's constitutional court ruled that the constitutional rights of nature were violated by the issuance of the mining permits that would harm the fragile ecosystems and the biodiversity of the forest, including species at high risk of extinction. Specifically, the court ruled that the government of Ecuador is obligated to apply Article 73 of Ecuador's constitution, which is part of the Rights of Nature chapter within the constitutional framework. Article 73 requires precautionary and restrictive measures to be taken to prevent the extinction of species. And the court wrote this in their ruling. They wrote, "It is not an option, but a constitutional obligation derived from the intrinsic value of nature. Indeed, the risk in this case is not necessarily related to human beings, but to the extinction of species, the destruction of ecosystems, the permanent alteration of natural cycles." Other rights of nature cases have now been decided that uphold the rights of ecosystems and of species, guaranteeing their protection as living entities unto themselves, with legal rights unto themselves, the protection of nature separate and apart from its value to humans, rights and protections that we humans must respect. The first rights of nature case in the United States was settled in a tribal court last year, 2023. The Soxhuatl tribe in Washington state brought a case against the city of Seattle on behalf of the rights of salmon, which the tribe considers to be a relative. Despite the tribe's treaty-protected right and obligation to protect fish migrating to and from the tribe's traditional fishing grounds, the city of Seattle constructed dams on the Skagit River without consulting any tribe. The dams obstruct the passage, of course, of fish going back upriver to their historic spawning grounds. The Skagit River is habitat for 5 wild salmon species, including 2 that are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act, and in addition, the southern resident killer whales in Puget Sound depend on the salmon from the river. The southern resident killer whales were listed as endangered in 2005. While this rights of nature case was pending in the Soxhuatl tribal court, the city agreed for the very first time to provide for fish passage around the dams. Tribal attorney for the Soxhuatl, Jack Fiander, he said this after the settlement was announced. He said, "This settlement agreement creates a roadmap to return salmon to their native ecosystem and restore the lifeblood of the tribes. It's time for the rights of fish and other species around the globe to be represented, just like the voice of the tribes needs to be honored." The Los Cedros case, the Soxhuatl case, and the growing number of laws and policies and court rulings on the rights of nature reflect a new understanding about the natural world, which of course for some, as we've heard today, is a very ancient understanding. That the natural world is not something that depends on us, but something we depend upon. It comes with the recognition that we are part of nature, not a ruler of nature, and an acknowledgement that the actions of humankind, we're destroying the very natural systems that sustain life, including our own lives. Colombia's Constitutional Court put it this way in its 2016 decision recognizing legal rights of the Atrato River. The court wrote, "Human populations are those that are interdependent of the natural world and not the other way around." The court added, "It is about understanding this new socio-political reality with the aim of achieving a respectful transformation with the natural world, as has happened before with civil and political rights. Justice for nature," the court said, "must be applied beyond the human scenario and must allow nature to be subject to rights." This need for a fundamental shift in humankind's relationship with the natural world is growing more obvious by the day. But the legal and cultural systems that we have in place are hardened against change. They have for too long ensured the exploitation of the natural world instead of its protection, for the benefit of a few over the many. But in the face of similar barriers, change has happened before. Broad-based people's movements were mobilized to fundamentally change how enslaved people, how women, how indigenous peoples, and others were treated by law and society. The resistance that past movements for legal rights have faced and what the movement for the rights of nature now faces, it was described and predicted in a seminal law review article written in 1972 by the University of Southern California law professor Christopher Stone. He planted the seeds of the idea for today's rights of nature movement. In his law review article titled, "Should Trees Have Standing?" Professor Stone wrote this. He wrote, "Each time there is a movement to confer rights onto some new entity, the proposal is bound to sound odd or frightening or laughable. This is partly because until the rightless thing receives its rights, we cannot see it as anything but a thing for the use of us, those who are holding rights at the time." He continued, "There will be resistance to giving the thing rights until it can be seen and valued for itself. Yet it is hard to see it and value it for itself until we can bring ourselves to give it rights, which is almost inevitably going to sound inconceivable to a large group of people." The transformation that it takes for larger and larger groups of people to change their minds, we believe, is beginning. And it's being helped along with every fire, every hurricane, every extinction. Today, we see people, communities, governments, and even courts across nations and across continents recognize that the status quo isn't working, that something fundamental needs to change. And that this change, it won't come if we simply try to make fracking better, or factory farming better, or sludging better. Those who came before, the abolitionists, the indigenous rights movement, the civil rights movement, the suffragists, and many, many others, they came together to make the fundamental social change that truly defines American history. They wrote a new story, and they knew that no one else was going to write it for them. They faced opposition from seemingly insurmountable forces that sought to maintain the status quo and maintain their own power. It was these people coming together, it was their bravery in the face of all of that that made a new world possible. As those past movements demonstrate, fundamental change comes when we decide to join together, to demand change, to drive change, to force change. Their work and our work today is aimed at making those major shifts to address root causes and achieve the systemic change that is needed. That new story is being written today, and it began once upon a time in 2006 when one community forged a new way forward, recognizing that nature itself was to be respected and protected for itself. This is a story about a new and growing understanding about our role as humans, as being part of nature, not separate or superior to nature, understanding that harm we do to nature is harm done to ourselves. As with past movements, this new story represents as much a legal shift as a cultural one, and it can't come soon enough. As Columbia's Constitutional Court put it, ruling for the very first time that an ecosystem in that country possessed legal rights, the court wrote this, Now is the time to begin taking the first steps to effectively protect the planet before it is too late. So this talk was titled, Who Speaks for the Trees? From the Dr. Seuss story of the Lorax. So, who speaks for the trees? My hope is that we all do. Thank you. Oh my God, he said I gave him hell.
Do we have any questions out? Do we have any questions?
Hi, my name's Marcia. I'm here in the back. And I'm from Bozeman, and I just want to say, sign me up. That sounds great. And I wonder if you could take it from those larger areas and what we can do in our hometowns, where we have hundreds of trees coming down every year to address the housing crisis. And we have a small group in Bozeman, the Bozeman Tree Coalition, fighting for those trees. But any words of advice would be much appreciated.
Thank you. We work with a lot of local communities and local municipalities, towns, townships, cities, and rights of nature laws began in those places. I mean, the first places in the world to have rights of nature law have been local communities here in the United States, and it's birthed a movement. And that comes through doing things like drafting ordinances or moving a local ballot initiative to recognize that nature or some aspect of nature, like a river, possesses legal rights within your municipality, and that is certainly something we'd be happy to chat with you about how to move that forward.
That's good. Yeah. Anyone else?
I don't see any other hands up here. I have questions for you about offline, my own issue on saving a river. But anyway, Mari, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You know, you were our last speaker, and we had Bill McKibben as our first speaker. And what bookends for this presentation? They're both scary, and they're also hopeful. Thank you very much.